review and have come to the conclusion that perhaps the applications that we received did not have the diversity of thought that we were hopeful to receive. And so I'm going to make a recommendation that we actually continue to leave the application period open until 5 p.m. next Monday, so that would be January 29th, and that I would consider the applications that I've already recommended for approval, along with any new ones, and then recommend appointments at that point in time. The issue so you will need to decide if you want to do that or actually just deal with the recommendations this evening. But if you do want me to extend the application period, the important thing that we need to decide is should the first meeting of the group be extended. So the first meeting of the group is scheduled for next Wednesday, January 31st. And that group is already set up. If we extended the application period, you would not have a chance to review my recommended appointments before January 31st. The next time you'd have an opportunity to weigh in would be February 6th, which means that the first meeting of the group would be delayed until at some point after February 6th. So I'm sort of seeking your direction on would you accept my recommendation that we extend the application period to January 29th? And if so, do you want to proceed with the January 31st date, or should I find another date so that you can review the recommendations on February 6th?
So Jane, thank you for this. I was wondering, in our materials, I know that there's a desire for the report from the working group, to be completed by March 15th, and then that report would be delivered to council something like April 15th. Would it hurt the effort, this delay by 1 week or so, if the report was due like 1 week later and it came to council 3 weeks later?
I don't think so. The point of trying to get things done by March 15th was so that if there were going to be changes in the city code provisions regarding initiatives, that those would be in effect by early May. So I don't know the timing as well as perhaps my colleague David does. What do you think?
No, I think that we could still work within that timeline, and I guess worst case, if we get pushed up against the election season, there's always the option of adopting any ordinances that would relate to the next election by emergency.
And we would have to make those decisions by late August, latest first week of September, correct?
Well, I think that there are potentially two categories of ordinances that could come out of this. The first, of course, being revisions to our election code. That would be one. The other would be changes to our charter. And if there are charter changes, then those would just get kicked into our normal, into the charter committee making a recommendation, our study session in May on what goes on the ballot or what you want to consider, and then into the ballot season over the summer. Thank you.
And just to follow up to that, David, that was helpful. With respect to those that are ordinance changes, it appeared from Jane's memo that there's really two groups of things. Those that are more time sensitive relating to referendums and initiatives, which would be helpful for us to decide on by March, April timeframe, because typically those are submitted in the June, July timeframe, versus those that relate to campaign finance that probably don't need to be bottomed out until the summertime.
That's correct.
Okay.
So I have a thought. One is, what if you just held it up until the end of the week? Yeah. And then proceeded. If you pick people on Monday, will they have time to get to the meeting by Wednesday?
Yeah, I don't know.
So that might be one thought, is close it Friday, and I don't know if that, not that you should work over the weekend, but anyhow, just a thought. And I guess for my purposes, what I just want to see is a diverse group of people that have something to offer on this topic, that are reasonably collaborative. And I trust you to choose that. And I don't need to see the list again.
Yeah.
I agree with what Zan just said.
I do as well.
Other thoughts? Mary?
I agree as well. Okay. It seems like a consensus to me. So I will extend it to 5 p.m. this Friday. And I'm going to expect that there won't be a lot of new applications, maybe 5 or 6. So I'll have plenty of time to review them and make a decision that evening. So I'll send that out either Friday night or Saturday morning so that people will have an opportunity. I had already talked with our communications department that this could be coming. So we'll be ready to issue a press release tomorrow morning and social media as well. So I think that we can make this happen, and I appreciate that and your confidence. Great.
Okay. Thank you.
Oh, just so you know, I think I said this before, but just to be clear, I'm going to write to all of the people that were recommended for appointment to let them know that it's been delayed until the end of the week, so that they're aware of that. So, okay?
That your letter last Monday was not final.
Right, and that, just so you know, the letter that I sent them on Monday said that it was all contingent upon this meeting and council approval of the recommendation. So we'll just let them know that it's been delayed for a few days.
Excellent. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Okay. Next. You want to do?
Yeah, so the next is the Boulder Shelter Management Plan and Sheltering Policies. And this is a follow-up to our discussion a couple of weeks ago on January 4th, as well as conversations with regard to the Boulder Shelter Management Plan, which we really didn't talk about on January 4th. We had talked about in December. And so Karen Ron has been listening and answering questions. You have a memo in your packet, and she's ready to make that presentation right now. Karen.
Thank you. So I'm going to go through just some of the highlights that are in the memo, because there was a lot of information in the memo in response to all of the questions that council had from January 5th, and then also some follow-up questions. And we probably have a little more specific information in particular for Lisa in response to her questions also. So just to give you an update on where the shelter management plan update and approval is. Let's see if we can do this. Okay. Okay, you can't see it. Oh, you can see it over there. Okay, so that's not going to change on the main screen there. So I think the only screen that's changing is the one up there on the left. Or is that one not? Yes, that's the only one. There we go. Okay. Okay, so just to quickly recap the shelter management plan process, on December 5th, council provided some specific direction regarding new language for the shelter management plan revisions, and these 2 items were provided to the shelter staff and board for consideration. One in particular was related to SVPs at the shelter and making sure that that language was consistent with council direction. Another thing that council wanted us to take a look at was including in the management plan conflict resolution policies. We did not include that in the shelter management plan revisions. However, those processes will be included in the city contracting process, in the city contract. The reason for that is because there's a number of conflict resolution nuances and policies and procedures that, if they were in the management plan, would require the shelter to come back with all of those changes for city manager consideration and review. So we felt that from a staff perspective, that incorporating the requirements for conflict resolution, which we'll talk a little bit about later, that we could include that in the city contracting process with the shelter. So based on the feedback, the shelter submitted a revised management plan on January 19th. The revision was consistent regarding SVPs with council direction. and the planning review team completed their review and submitted to the city manager for a decision on January 22nd. So the specific language that the shelter submitted for their management plan approval, you can see here, the shelter will not serve sexually violent predators who are on parole, and the shelter will discontinue services to all SVPs if an alternative sheltering option for this population becomes available in Boulder County. Through attrition, the shelter will reduce its SVP population to a maximum of 1 person. Currently, there are 4 SVPs at the shelter, and when this management plan goes into effect, that would mean 3 of those would need to be evicted from the shelter.
Yeah, I have some questions.
Yes. Sure.
But going from 4 to 1,
Yes.
that's not necessarily attrition. I mean, you would think they would rotate out. So I'm just kind of curious.
Right, so as the
How'd that
current
work?
residents, those 4 current residents leave the shelter, that space is not replaced, not available for an SVP.
But the ones that are there would continue on as long as they're there?
Until they're rehoused or leave voluntarily or find housing elsewhere.
And one last question. So let's say those guys leave, you have left 1. So what is the shelter supposed to do when they get another SVP? Say, no, you can't come here?
Yes. That's what the policy states.
Okay. And so I assume in that case, they would maybe refer them to severe weather shelter or some other venue?
Yes, they could go to severe weather shelter. That would be available to them. However, if they violate behavioral rules or program rules, particularly related to the safety of themselves or other clients or staff, they could be suspended from severe weather shelter.
Thank you. Yep.
Karen, did you say something about they would need to be evicted right away? But that's not the case, right? Attrition means that they can stay until their term is up.
That's correct. Without that language, when the
Without that
management plan
okay.
goes into effect, they would be evicted from the shelter.
Misheard you, but with
Yes.
the language proposed,
Yes, that would not
be through
happen.
natural attrition. Okay, that's great. Thank you.
So what programs are the SVPs in now? Because my understanding is housing-focused shelter is what the majority of the beds are supposed to be at the shelter. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's what the majority of beds are.
So then 2 questions. One is, are the SVPs in housing-focused shelter, and did they get there through coordinated entry?
So I'm going to have, that's a detailed question. I don't know. I'm going to have Greg, who's the executive director, Greg Harms, come up and answer that question for us.
So one of the 4 has left, so we're down to 3. One of those SVPs is really only using morning services right now, so we have 2 people who are in reserve bed program.
So is that housing-focused shelter?
It is.
And did they come in through coordinated entry?
They did.
Okay. And then another question is, we saw that during severe weather, the bed count at the shelter is about 150 people occupying beds, give or take 140 to 150. And then there was a mention of a lottery system. So can you explain to me the distribution of housing-focused shelter beds versus severe weather shelter at the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless and how that works?
Yeah, so we're considering everything at the shelter, housing-focused shelter. The severe weather shelter is at a separate location run by the Bridge House organization, so two separate programs. Our numbers at the shelter have bounced around from the 130s to 160. The lottery that you mentioned is if we hit 160, if we have more people asking for housing-focused shelter than we have room, we run a lottery to see who gets in. We've only had to do that once this year. So one time we were over capacity and had to use the lottery system.
So those 140 to 160 are all housing-focused shelter?
Correct.
Got it. And are most of those people staying for a long time, 90 days? What's the, because I know we've had a lot of exits, so what's the profile at the shelter?
So between 100 and 120 folks are in our reserve bed program, and the rest of the people who are coming are on what we call standby, so they're kind of on a night-to-night basis. Some people have been in reserve beds since October. Some are just joining it. It's kind of fluid, so people move in and out on a daily basis.
What are reserve beds and what are the other beds?
So when you go through coordinated entry, you get referred to housing focused shelter. That's at the shelter. You have the option when you come to the shelter, you can either go on a standby basis, which means you just show up, and if there's space, you get a bed, or you can sign up for a reserve bed, which is a guaranteed bed every night. So it's up to the client to choose what path they want to take.
So what are the differences between those two? Why would somebody choose a standby bed over a reserve bed?
A reserve bed requires that you be there every night and requires that you do a chore, so there's a few obligations there. Some people don't want to sign up to be at the shelter every night. They just want to use it as they need it. So we have that option.
So if you have a reserve bed, can you stay there arbitrarily long and leave and come as you choose versus a standby bed? Do you have to leave at 8 in the morning or 7 in the morning?
Right now, everyone leaves at 8 in the morning.
So even housing-focused shelters still leaving at 8 in the morning?
Yes.
So there's no vocational training or programs that are intended for day services for people who are bed?
We're still under the old management plan, so we don't have the ability to do any day services yet, so.
That's what we're changing.
So if we approve this, will you begin doing day services? Say it gets approved next week. Will people still have to leave at 8 in the morning if they're in housing-focused shelter?
I can answer that.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a little further down in the presentation, but yes, when the management plan is approved, then clients would be eligible to stay at the shelter. One of the things we're working through right now is the funding for day services, because when we implemented the system and we're looking at standing up the navigation center plus program-based, year-round sheltering, program-based, adding case management, housing-focused shelter case management to the shelter, we've been looking at all of these costs. We will have to add funding for the day services, and we're working on that right now and what the existing source of funding that we have to be able to implement that when the management plan is approved.
So why don't we go back to the
Yep.
presentation, and you'll be here, right? Yeah.
One question in that.
Sure.
Greg, could you explain a little more about the lottery system? How does that work? Is it first come, first serve? Do you give preferences to people who are disabled or senior? How does that work?
No, so the lottery system is those folks who have not signed up for reserve bed. So it's people who are only on standby who go through the lottery. And we run the lottery if we think we're going to be full, and it's just that, it's a lottery.
So you just pick a number or pick a name?
You pick a number.
Thanks.
It's a good thing you're only right there. 'Cause now we're coming up to suspension policies.
He made it one slide.
That's all right. He's. Okay, and as I just mentioned, we are now looking at how to fund the additional day services, the year-round services and program-based, our housing-focused shelter are funded. The shelter is going to be adding a case manager to really focus on housing. So we do have a funding gap for the day services portion, which we think we'll be able to come up with a plan for very soon. So suspension policy and procedures was another area that council was very interested in. So we talked with the shelter and Bridge House about their suspension policies. All, as Greg said, all of the suspensions prior to October 1st have expired, with the exception of safety-related suspensions, and the shelter currently has 12 safety-related suspensions. Bridge House has 1. Suspended individuals can go to severe weather sheltering. Once they get to severe weather sheltering, they would have to comply with rules and behavioral policies there as well. So another area that council was interested in was transportation options, particularly for people who are under suspension, and how would they get to severe weather sheltering on those days that they needed to access shelter. So we've been working with the shelter and Bridge House through coordinated entry to make sure that the information on where severe weather sheltering is very robustly put out into the community so people know that. And we're also looking at transportation options, either a cab to get to severe weather sheltering, if that's someone's only option, or bus passes. But we will be funding some option for that group of clients who have no other option except severe weather sheltering so that they can get there. You were also interested in an ombudsperson role, or our community mediation services serving in some conflict resolution capacity, particularly for the shelter. So currently, our community mediation program does work with the shelter in resolving post-grievance issues. So if a client who's been through the grievance process at the shelter would like to go through mediation to resolve those conflicts, they are currently using mediation, and we've had a couple of clients over the last couple of years that have used that service to resolve conflicts with the shelter. So those referrals are currently being made to CMS. Mediation is also at eviction court. They work with clients who are being evicted or about to be evicted, either to extend their eviction time so they have more time to find alternative housing. Things like preventing an eviction to show up on their credit report, and to connect clients with support services. They also work with our public housing agencies across in Boulder and Boulder County to prevent evictions. So some additional services that we've been exploring with mediation and the shelter and the courts would be providing earlier information and involvement in eviction court process to prevent evictions, see if there's some way of resolving conflicts which would actually prevent an eviction. Mediation is also looking at youth-facing housing instability, mediation with parents for younger people, training for homelessness agency staff and conflict resolution. So this has been an area that there's been some interest expressed in, to help staff resolve conflicts with clients before it escalates to a suspension. This would be under suspension prevention assistance. Also, re-entry assistance for suspended clients. So working with clients who are no longer suspended, and then how can they get back into services and increase their likelihood of success and not being evicted or suspended again from the shelter or from Bridge House or another service. We're also looking at expansion of the services that were on the previous slide that are already being provided. So these are the kinds of things in terms of conflict resolution and support for clients that are being considered.
Karen,
Yes.
which court serves the eviction process?
So I'm going to have Clay come up. So Clay Fong is our Community Mediation Services Manager, and I think some of the things that they are doing and considering would be helpful for him to explain.
Yes, so eviction court is handled in the 20th District Court, so it's county court. In terms of kind of a logistical matter, they're typically held every Friday morning, the hearings, and it can be about 20 to 40 cases can be heard at any given time. You have a lot of cases. I would say we've just had a bunch sort of built up over the holidays, but I'd say you'll have 20 cases on the docket, which is generally generated the evening before. So some of those cases get resolved, so they have a lot of no-shows. Unfortunately, in a lot of instances, tenants don't show up. So a lot of those will get default judgments, and you might be looking at, maybe 4 or 5 where you have both parties present. And unfortunately, tenants just sort of get the judgment against them. But I'd say 20 is a good average.
And you say it's county court that handles
Yes,
it?
evictions are handled in county court because they're governed by state law and not municipal law.
And, well, I'm just curious, so those hearings are to actually mediate there in
Yes,
public in a courtroom?
well, we take it outside of the courtroom,
Okay.
but we do, they're very much on the fly. There's time pressure, and what we're really trying to do is to see if something can be accomplished, either a payment plan to sort of prevent the eviction from going through, or in some instances, just simply to reduce some of the hardship of the eviction. Can we have a little more time to get somebody out? But it's very quick, very on the fly.
And so do people contact you then, or do you intervene? Do you read the court docket and get names, or?
Well, the judges are partners, so typically what will happen is the judge will first take roll essentially to see if there are cases where both parties are present, and then the judge will, if there hasn't been some sort of agreement made, because in some cases the attorneys will sort of self-mediate and see if they can come up with something. But in typical examples where you have what's called a pro se parties, where they're not represented by attorneys, what a judge will do is will refer them, say, we have some mediators in the back of the room. Before we move forward, I'd like you to speak with them and see if something can be worked out.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I wanted to address 2 things here. One was appeals to community mediation after a homeless service provider has provided some kind of suspension of services to a client. And then the other is a reentry assistance. So have you had many occasions in the last couple of years to work with clients of homeless service providers who have been suspended?
We've had a few. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a great number, but, we've had a handful.
A handful, okay. And how does that process go right now?
Typically, they've actually, there's 2 ways, but a lot of them have actually come through as potential discrimination complaints to the Office of Human Rights. And typically, people feel that they've been excluded for discriminatory reasons. And what we would do in that instance is we would, do intakes essentially both with the client and the agency that they're dealing with, and then we would run them through sort of a typical mediated process with the hope of coming up with some sort of written agreement that would create clear expectations for each party, which may or may not include a path to reentry, or it may also be a path to address a grievance that a client may have that's not necessarily related to reentry, but that a client may have with that agency.
So what if it's not a discriminatory situation? In other words, it's just a simple dispute of facts.
Yeah. Well, in some instances, there may not be as much as we can sort of do with that if there's like, an exact violation of policy, and, a violation of policy is a violation of policy. And if there's a safety issue, if there's a legitimate safety issue, we don't want to override that. But oftentimes what mediation can do is kind of around the margins maybe explore a path for both the client and the agency to work together in the future. For example, I'm thinking of one case, and I do have a confidentiality piece that I can't get into detail, but it was where, granted, there was the suspension would still stand for a while, but then there was a clearer path for the client to re-enter than there might have been absent mediated conversation.
Got it. I think that's one of the concerns here generally is when people want to make an appeal, the principle would be you don't have the same agency that issued the suspension hear the appeal because there could be conflict of interest there. So what are your thoughts on the possibility of being or creating some kind of appeals process? Because right now the grievance process, some suspension occurs, and then the grievance process goes within the same organization, and then perhaps they move on to the mediation services to mitigate the judgment. Is there any way that you can see of intervening as part of the appeals or grievance process?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think it's really almost, are we willing to take on more of a quasi-judicial role and maybe having more decision-making power than what we might have as sort of a mediator, which it's really up to the parties to come up with that. And I think, there would need to be some sort of structural and philosophical changes. I think there's specific expectations, like if you're looking at an ombuds function where a person's decision ultimately may be binding, or what they call a mediation arbitration model where we try to mediate, but if we can't do it, then that impasse needs to be broken by the person making the actual decision. Currently, we don't have people that are qualified that within the team. I mean, those qualifications can be received through training and the like, but right now, I don't think we have that capability given just the qualifications of our staff.
So if it were the will of council that be something that we explored, do you think it's a possibility? I mean, how extensive would it be to acquire that capability?
Actually, some of those trainings aren't terribly difficult. I mean, they're not like getting a master's degree or anything like that. They're relatively brief. I think some can be done in a week, but I think it's important that if one were to undertake such a thing, that the proper credentials, be part of it all. And, I think it is doable. But the other question that I would just put out there is that, fundamentally the mediation service has acted as a neutral since the 80s. And this is a pretty significant change in the mission and scope of what the mediation service does. And I think I haven't fully thought out, what are the implications for that? What are some of the concerns that may bring? Because it really is changing that role, which is to say it's not doable, but I just want to make sure we look at what potential downsides might be to that. Is there a reluctance for people to bring stuff to us if there's a feeling that we're also, we may pass judgment on them later on? I mean, I don't know. So those are I would put those out as cautions. I wouldn't say those are deal breakers, but I think there's just a few things we need to be aware of.
Sure. I mean, in addition to that, if the agencies wouldn't be willing to do this, not worth talking about, but I was just curious from your standpoint. And so thank you for the answers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Okay, I'll just go back there. Thanks.
Okay, we'll move on to severe weather sheltering because there was additional information that council requested around. If we expanded severe weather sheltering, If we expanded severe weather sheltering to additional days, what would those costs look like? There was also a question about how we went about developing those options. That's in the packet. I'm not going to spend much detail about that so that we can get to a little bit more about if severe weather sheltering days were expanded, what would the costs and the upsides and downsides of that be? So just to recap a little bit, in the development of the strategy and the working group recommendations, there was a historic trend of increasing costs and resources going for adult emergency services without an exit path to programs and services or housing. The working group recommendations and the homelessness strategy identified about 20 additional days besides the 210 beds that were available in the new system for severe weather sheltering. So the intent of that was to provide some additional sheltering during severe weather for those clients who were not in shelter programs, but were at risk on the street so that they did have a place that they could go. So just a little recap. So in September of 2017, council requested staff to explore more than these 20 days. We did the research on the hazards to human health. The range of conditions and variables were very broad to be practical for establishing really specific thresholds for severe weather sheltering. We've talked about this before at other meetings. We wanted to be sure that we included all of the National Weather Service watches and warnings in addition to whatever the temperature or condition thresholds were. And we did this, we researched also weather patterns in Boulder County for the last 3 years. So in considering this balance of adding additional severe weather shelter beds with what the goal of the strategy is, there was definitely a desire to avoid developing a parallel system of sheltering, which is what we used to have, but ensure that there was a safety net for those people who are at risk on the street. We also looked at assessment of other communities' criteria, which was pretty broad, and there was a number of different criteria, and also discovered there was no standard definition of what severe weather is. So council approved the standards that we had on October 24th of last year, and the standards that you see up there are the ones that council approved, and that's an estimated 60 to 80 annual days. We contracted with Bridge House for this service for up to $100,000 a year to provide that severe weather sheltering. So council also asked for information about if we went to the old BOHO criteria for sheltering, which you see that criteria up there, that would expand sheltering to about 140 to 150 nights. And the estimated cost for that would be about $180,000, plus potential additional costs, which we don't know at this time, for coordinated entry, housing-focused shelter, or navigation services. And this is a reference to, right now, folks who come to severe weather sheltering. They are encouraged and referred to coordinated entry following their stay at severe weather sheltering. If we were significantly expanding this, there may be many more people being referred to coordinated entry or housing-focused shelter program, and so there may be some staffing implications there that we are unaware of right now. So we also looked at extending severe weather sheltering to the entire sheltering season, typical sheltering season, which is October 1st to May 1st, which is about 212 days. And that our cost estimates are $232,000 plus those additional potential costs if there's impacts on coordinated entry or housing-focused shelter. So I think I've already mentioned some of these concerns about that we looked at and concerns that came up regarding expanding severe weather sheltering. So it's increasing significant additional funding requests over time historically for services not connected to long-term solutions. So we would have to really guard against that. It's the potential for creating a parallel sheltering system. In severe weather shelter or additional sheltering every night during the season, it may make it a little more difficult to meet our new system goals if those clients do not have service plans and exits to housing. The strategy prioritizes new resources to exit homelessness, rather than expand emergency sheltering. And it could also potentially expand options for people not connected to the community without any service entry conditions or criteria. Just those are all things that you've heard before and have been part of the considerations in the past. And so this chart's just a recap of adult shelter utilization, including severe weather shelter, housing-focused shelter, and Bridge House Path to Home. So you can see peak 2 nights of peak capacity, 235 on the 21st of December and 248 on the 26th of December. So these 2 nights exceeded the, and you will see there's another there's a 220 up there. These nights and a 212, these exceeded the 210 capacity of the existing ongoing programs, and those were severe weather shelter nights. People could access severe weather shelter beds at those sites on those nights.
Karen, can I interrupt you for a quick question? At the bottom it says severe weather shelter utilization of 100 beds. Mm-hmm. Is that true every night? I know that the venues change from time to time. Is that an average or is that a minimum?
That's the usual capacity. So if we need additional severe weather sheltering beds, that's the usual capacity of 100 additional beds.
Does it ever go below that, or are there any churches that are only at 80 or 70 or something like that?
I think there probably are. Isabel could probably answer that question. Yeah, sure.
So it would be, as Isabel comes up here, it would be kind of nice to know what the the minimum is. In other words, what is our minimum capacity on those nights that we happen to be rotating through a church or a synagogue that doesn't have 100 beds?
Hi, good evening. I'm Isabel McDevitt with Bridge House. So we have an arrangement with the faith community until we can get into the site on 30th Street. And every night of the week, we're able to offer the standard 50 beds for Path to Home. But some of those faith sites, we can go up to an additional 100. Usually we would want to keep it to just 100, but some spaces can do up to 150. So on severe weather shelter nights where we have a space that can't go over the 50, or in some cases it's 60, we will open an additional site to account for severe weather shelter. So some nights we're able to accommodate it. For example, Har Hashem or St. Andrew can accommodate, well over 50. But at a night like Atonement Lutheran, we would offer an additional site right next door at Har Hashem to make sure we can have the capacity for severe weather shelter.
So would it be true to say that through those backup arrangements you have, that you always have 50 plus 100 beds available, 150 between Path to Home and the severe weather shelter?
We can, yes. I would say the highest number that we've had combined Path to Home and severe weather shelter this season was 95, and that was on the 26th.
Great.
So we've been mindful of resources to make sure that we have that capacity, but we haven't seen the need to have a full other 100 beds. We're really looking at the 50 beds until we need to, but we have contingency plans to make sure that's available.
And just to complete the picture, on December 26th, when you used 96 of those beds, the other 152 people, because we have 248 people sheltered the night, were at the Boulder Shelter for the Homeless in North Boulder.
Correct, I believe so, yeah.
Thanks.
As we're rolling coordinated entry out, have you, if this was January, have you seen an increase in the severe weather bed usage or Path to Home?
So I looked at our numbers today. Our average for severe weather shelter nights across the season has been 71 combined, so 50 Path to Home plus 21 severe weather shelter folks. And I believe last night we had 50 folks at our primary Atonement location, and then another 35 at Har Hashem. So we're still not seeing, much higher.
So how does the population in the severe weather shelter, how is that changing night to night? Is it the same people, or are you getting a real mix-up of?
That's a great question. So what we're seeing is a combination of people who are brand new to the system, and then we refer to coordinated entry. We're seeing a combination of people who have been screened for housing focus shelter or Path to Home that are not currently engaging in program plans, who are coming to severe weather shelter, and then we make every effort to get them engaged in those program services. And then we're seeing a portion of people who are informed of, the additional resources who just choose not to come back. So it's a real combination. We've provided city staff with a lot of detail on that we could send to you.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Sure.
So, Isabel, if we were to look at changing the temperature triggers and moving to something that was more like 65% of the nights in the sheltering season, would that be something that if resources were provided that Bridge House could manage?
We would certainly look into it. That would have to be a board decision of ours. We are well equipped to provide these services. That's why we, submitted to do so. I think, that would be something we would strongly consider.
And do you want to tell us anything about your thoughts on the weather triggers and because we're trying to think of a balance between a parallel sheltering system, but also making sure that people are safe. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it is tough. We have changed the whole system, and I think we're seeing some really, really positive outcomes from the perspective of engaging folks in a much deeper program opportunity and really being able to position coordinated entry not as a punishment, but as an opportunity to get more services, whether that's through housing-focused shelter or with Path to Home. But that doesn't mean that there's not a big culture shift, particularly for folks who have been in our community who are pretty service resistant. So I think it is a delicate balance. I don't believe that there's risk of changing that culture by changing the temperature degrees by a fair amount. I do still think that there's a reality that there are going to be folks who are going to still choose to be outside of the system because this is a very significant change to what they're used to. So I think we have to work diligently on the housing exits, and we have to work diligently on making our programs attractive so that people actually take advantage of them, and that we have the assets that were anticipated in the plan. I mean, the plan anticipates 2 24/7 facilities. Neither one of those is up and running right now. So the plan is not fully implemented, and until it is, I think we've got to keep our eye on the ball of what the plan is supposed to do, which is to help people get housed. So for this season, because we're still in transition, I think we should consider some different options, but I still would say that the overall direction of focusing on housing is the right one.
Can I push you a little further? If you were going to make recommendations to us this evening for this season of transition on severe weather shelter, what would they be?
Wow, really put me on the spot.
You don't
well,
have to
again,
answer that.
I need to preface this that my board has some, strong opinions about this. I would say that given what we're seeing as far as capacity, we have capacity to do more around severe weather shelter. I think that, the 21-degree mark does feel like it is a little arbitrary when it's 22 degrees. However, I think we should not look at a complete every night of the season. I think we could maybe look to our sister communities to see whether we could rise that temperature a little bit. I'm sure city staff has done research on that. But we absolutely have capacity within our current programs. I mean, we are not having to open faith community after faith community after faith community to accommodate the need. As you saw in that chart, we do have some additional capacity.
So, yeah, we have BOHO up here. And I was wondering what would happen if we went to those criteria, the BOHO criteria, with 32 without precipitation and 38 degrees with precipitation.
It's plus every night.
Right.
There's two different BOHO criteria. There was the original BOHO criteria, and then there was the BOHO every night criteria.
Right.
I think what's up for discussion is the original BOHO criteria, which would raise the temperature to the 32-degree mark.
That's what I'm interested in.
Yeah. I think if we did that, we would be open more nights, but I don't anticipate that service usage would be that different. I still don't think we're going to see 100 more people show up. I think it would, the reality is that the changes around the requirement of coordinated entry have already changed the culture in the community. And I think, a lot of folks are taking advantage of the new resources, which is great. And I think there's people who are service resistant who it's easier for them to, and less confusing for them to just stay wherever they are and not come in for shelter under any circumstance, even if they know about it and even if it's night to night, because it's too hard to figure it out night to night. So temperature criteria probably won't change that for some folks, but certainly for the people in limbo, I think it would be helpful to have more options when we're just on that sort of fringe temperature.
Thank you.
Okay. We covered the questions?
Thank you, Isabel. That's
Nope.
very helpful.
You have
Do you
another?
sorry, you're almost done. Do you have recommendations for those that are service resistant in this new plan? Well, it's the second time this week that I've heard that this is an issue. And so what are your thoughts there?
Well, anticipated in the plan was that, again, the goal is housing. So we know in this community, as evidenced by the homeless outreach team and the municipal court navigator, we've put resources into folks who we know don't walk through the doors of service providers. They never have, or if they have, it's been in really sporadic ways, yet they're very well known to the community. So we are still working with the housing resources in the region through the One Home coordinated entry system for permanent supportive housing to try to get those folks housed. And they may never walk in the door of the shelter or Bridge House, but they are still on the housing priority list given their vulnerability and their length of time in the community. So they're still known to us, but they may not be using services day to day or night to night.
Mary?
And so the reasons for which they're service resistant would be addressed in permanent supportive housing? Is that kind of what I hear you saying?
Yes, I mean, permanent supportive housing, Housing First as a model was developed for folks to basically leapfrog the need of having to be in a shelter right into housing. It's a great solution for someone who maybe, has so much trauma that they can't be in a shelter environment with a lot of people, or their, high level needs around mental health. And again, being with a lot of people is tough, or, addictions, kind of preclude them from being part of a community dynamic. So it's a great option. I will say that it's an option for a small percentage of the population, just given, the criteria you have to meet to be eligible for those services. But it's certainly a great resource for folks who are living on our streets right now.
And does the permanent supportive housing option take care of most of the service resistant? Or is it a smaller, I'm trying to get an idea of who that addresses in that category.
Well, it's a combination of, first, we need the resource, so it's a scarce resource. But when someone is identified as being eligible for a Housing First unit, whether that's through, the Muni Court Navigator or another service provider, then there's quite a bit of work to do around, making sure that they have identification and all the things you would need for a landlord. So the concept behind putting folks into the Housing Focused Shelter program, if they're willing to do that and to have an environment where they feel comfortable and can be while that process happens, is to try to get more people off the street. Because that takes a while. There's a bureaucratic process about housing, no matter how low barrier the housing might be for the individual. So it can work, but it takes a lot of resources to even get someone ready to be, approved by a landlord.
Cool. So we're going to let you finish. Here, you grab your mic.
Okay, and you also wanted a little bit of a recap on an update on system results to date, and they are very encouraging. So through December, there's been 87 exits countywide into housing, 74 from the city of Boulder, 14 to housing from Housing Focused Shelter, 13 to housing from Path to Home Navigation, 10 went into residential programs, employment or substance abuse. 2 clients reconciled with family or friends in Boulder, and 35 were reunified with support systems outside of Boulder County. Yeah.
Can you explain the residential program just a little bit more?
I think Wendy can explain that. I'm not familiar with which residential programs that.
Good evening, Wendy Schwartz, Homeless Programs Manager. In these cases, there were 10 that went to the Bridge House Ready to Work program, so that's the employment program, and one that went into residential substance abuse treatment.
Thanks.
Okay, that's the end of our presentation, so additional
So we
questions?
could have lots of questions, but the goal for this evening is, you want to tell everybody?
So the goal for the evening was just an update on what council had, information that council had requested.
And can you, before we get to questions, the next steps in terms of city managers as the authority, not this council, about the shelter plan and just kind of where we're at in that?
So the city manager has, I believe, the disposition from the planning staff, and she'll be making a decision after tonight.
So basically, whatever we want to say to the city manager about her pending decision, so this plan can go forward and actually be implemented. Okay, and we're over our time, so with that in mind, questions that are pertinent to that.
So I had put out a list of questions today.
Yes.
I don't need them answered tonight in light of time, but if I could get those answered on hotline, that would be very helpful.
Yes, be happy to do that. Yep.
Aaron,
Well, I don't have additional questions. Just when we're done, I have a few comments.
can we go ahead with comments, everyone? Okay, shoot.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank the shelter for being responsive to some of the feedback that we've given over the last few months. And Karen, thank you also for being responsive to the concerns and issues that we've raised recently. So it seems like we're really heading in the right direction here. I just wanted to zero in on a couple things. One of them is the mediation question. So Clay had some great answers about how that program is working right now, which I appreciated. But it sounded like it's not quite clear how we might get that function that I think we were interested in, that Sam was zeroing in on, about, if there's an appeals process at the shelter for a penalty, how there could be someone to help at least facilitate, that being an advocate or something like that. So
Yeah.
I think that seems like it needs a little more work. Seems like possibly the mediation services could provide that, but it's not a slam dunk. So
It's not, because it is voluntary right now, and I think, as Clay suggested, we could do a little more work on looking at arbitration, which is more of a quasi-judicial function, and I think, that would have to be explored before we could do something like that. And then I think we could talk with the shelter a little bit more about how we might be able to be part of the appeals process, because these are policies of the shelter board and the shelter operation. We don't want to step into their process that they've established before they've had an opportunity to run that process. But we do hear you that we don't want to get to the end of that process without having some type of appeals or conflict resolution part of that.
And from my perspective, it's less about stepping into what
Yep.
they're doing and more about, if that doesn't work out, that we, have some way of providing some.
Of a required process.
Of an additional level. so that if
That's
people
required.
feel- I'm sorry,
That's required in the appeals process.
which part?
She's asking, do you want it required?
Well, I want to say that the option is always available,
Yes, and
rather than it's a required step.
it currently is available.
That's not what I was hearing from.
Yes.
So what I'm talking about is that someone who felt like they'd gone through the whole process with the shelter, but they felt like the outcome was not fair to them, that they would have people that they could come to at the city or some other third party who could say, let us help mediate that dispute with the sheltering program.
And we have done that, yes. But it's voluntary. It's voluntary on the part of the client.
Voluntary by whom?
On the part of the client and the shelter.
Well,
So a client could come and use our community mediation services if they didn't like the outcome of the grievance process, but they wouldn't be required to use it, and it would be voluntary for them to come. I think, and Greg, you can add to this, every time a client has come, the shelter has participated in that process voluntarily.
I guess I heard Clay talk about more of an arbitration function.
Yes.
Which I think is a little closer to what we've been advocating for.
Yes, and that would not necessarily be voluntary.
And isn't arbitration binding? So that we actually.
Yes, so maybe either Clay can come back up, or David can also weigh in, because now we're getting into a quasi-judicial process.
Right, and typically arbitration, when you get into that realm, it's a contractual remedy. So you usually define between parties what you want to dispute and then how you want to dispute it. So this is a little bit different in that you don't have a contract necessarily between the shelter and a client that we're involved in. So it's a tricky path.
So David, are you saying that arbitration doesn't really apply in this case?
I think it's typically not done in this type of a situation. So if we were to, so I'm kind of, this is off the cuff here a little bit, but if we were to do something, it would probably be where we would have a funding agreement or some other arrangement with the shelter, and as part of our funding arrangement, we would contract to have some kind of process available. So I would think that we would probably do it in a contract with the shelter. And we could offer hearing officers. Of course, it's going to be a contractual remedy, so of course you need a willing buyer and a willing seller of those services.
Okay, Sam wants in on this one too. I was going to say everybody wants in, so we'll just go Sam, Mary, Cindy here.
So-
Are you done with that? You want to just?
I want to hear, I want to start
Go
it.
ahead.
I'm pretty much right where Aaron is on this. I feel like we need to have a pathway that's well-known for the clients of any service provider. It's not just the shelter. It could be Bridge House or any other provider as well, so that we are providing them with funding. They're providing services to a community that we think is important that they be served in a certain way, but it's also important that there be a pathway to resolution for grievances that isn't just moderated by the people who made the original decision. And so I heard from Clay, mediation arbitration. It sounds like the process that was being considered would start with an attempt to mediate, to try and get both parties on board. And then if that did not work, then some kind of arbitration in which it's quasi-judicial and a third party, in this case the city, would make a decision about the merits of the case as they understood them. And I agree, David, it seems to me like, a contract that goes along with funding would be a legitimate way to have that conversation with the service providers, and we're providing them with a certain amount of funding. And it also provides, I think, the whole community with the sense that there's a pathway that isn't just within these service organizations, that the city's involved with trying to make sure that everyone gets treated fairly. And so I guess I'm interested in where Aaron was going with this, which is how can we work together, the city and the service providers, to make the best system so that if somebody is not happy with the resolution, not even saying ahead of time whose fault it may be, that there's a pathway to have that heard outside. So I'd like to keep exploring it. I don't know if it belongs in the management plan. It sounds like the contract may be a better place, the annual funding.
Yeah, I don't think, the management plan is a land use document, and this is really kind of, I don't want to overstate it or understate it, but it's almost like a human rights issue.
So I agree it belongs in the contract, not the management plan.
Right. So I think that's all from me.
Yep.
I do want to come back to, it's not on this subject, but I want to come back to the temperature triggers before we leave this.
Okay, so we'll come back to those. Let's resolve this. We're going to pick up the pace a little. Mary.
It sounds like the answer, my question was going to be about, would it be included in the contract and in the upcoming contract? If it could be included in the upcoming contract, that was my question, and it sounds like the answer is yes.
Yes.
And then Cindy.
Well, I'm just wondering how it's going to play out. It sounds to me that if there are two parties who are willing to mediate, and there isn't resolution that is there for the client, it could be for the other party as well, And if one enters these and our mediator is doing the job dispassionately, it seems that that kind of thing could be resolved at that level. And if there is an appeal process contractually tied to this, it seems, and then it's a binding resolution, if it's something, it seems that we wouldn't want to force a party into something in terms of taking care of a client if it's an unwilling thing to do. I mean, I just don't quite see where this is heading in terms of getting into an arbitration situation. And if it were to go that way, why wouldn't it be somewhere within the municipal court's purview? Again, which we would hope would be a dispassionate listener in terms of the mediation.
Well, so in terms of the municipal court, that's the easy one. So typically the municipal court is, they're equipped to enforce municipal violations and the prosecution of misdemeanors. And this is not really that. It's not this is more of a dispute resolution between two parties. So that in and of itself is not a particularly good fit. Our municipal court also serves the role of being hearing officers for city administrative actions. So we do some enforcement through administrative actions, and our court provides services through there. That's something that could be considered. It could also be somebody, we could also figure out some other hearing officer to hear these types of claims and disputes. So the second part of your question was?
I was just thinking, I didn't know if the court had a mediation service or not. I was thinking if there was a mediation service appended to the court process.
No.
Again, taking it out of the city council deciding
Sure.
this kind of thing.
Well, typically mediation, it's either done by the parties without the benefit of somebody helping them. It's with attorneys or through something like community mediation services. And a lot of times, if there's a frankly, a lot of our lawsuits settle through a mediation process. We don't take a lot of things to trial, and I think that, mediation services are often quite beneficial from that regard. But then if you have an unsatisfactory result from mediation, I think that what I believe Sam is describing is you'd have your ticket punched at complete mediation, and then once you did that, that would give you the right to ask for a hearing officer and then have it heard. I think another part of your question, this may be more appropriate for Karen, was just about providing services to people who have problems with the organization. And frankly, I think that that's something that as we look further into this, we're just going to have to figure that out, because I know that that we will have to figure out how to balance the interests of the one client who is making a complaint with those of the remaining people in the shelter to also be able to live in a safe environment.
That was basically what I was getting at. Yeah.
Okay. So what did you take away from that, Karen?
So you would like us to consider some options for conflict resolution that is more structured and formal, that would be a clear pathway for clients, that they have a clear pathway for a resolution to their problem. Is that what I heard?
Yeah,
Yep.
Mostly. I think the one other thing that I heard from the question about how often has this happened is not very often, a handful of times in the past few years. I think this would be something that we would want to be really well understood by the clientele as well as the service organizations. So just to make sure that they know, I mean, you've emphasized that it's voluntary, which is great, but for that to be something people can take up means they need to know about it. And so that would be the other piece, is making sure it's well understood, whatever the pathway is.
Okay.
Yes, we can bring that back to you.
Thank you.
But not hold up this agreement. Okay. Temperature?
I was just going to say that I think the original BOHO temperatures are something I'd be interested in us looking at to fund and to be the triggers for severe weather sheltering.
Which triggers?
38 degrees with precipitation, 32 degrees without.
So it's not the every night?
Not the every night, it's the-
just
yeah,
the days
yeah.
that have.
Not every night. It's the original
The original BOHO criteria.
severe weather criteria, which was 38 degrees with precipitation expected or 32 degrees without.
So that 180 seems to be both of those things. Is that right?
I'm sorry, the 180,000?
180,000 incremental cost seems to be both the every night between November 15, no, go back. Is that 180,000 just for the temperature change that Sam talked about, or is that also the every night between November 15 and?
That's the every night.
So what's the estimate on the temperature change one?
It's going to be somewhere between 100,000 and 180. It's going to be somewhere between our current cost and adding some additional days. We'll have to figure that out, but it'll be somewhere in.
But if we were focusing just on incremental
Because-
costs, we're
because
already
many-
committed on 100,000, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
So
right.
we're-
That's
so
right.
We're looking maybe in the 30 to 60,000 additional cost.
Yeah, and it could be on the higher end, because many of those every night days that are identified did meet these weather triggers.
Okay, and for the rest of this, are we talking for the rest of the season, the rest of this year, for the foreseeable future? I mean, we're in a period of transition, so I'm just clarifying.
Well, I mean, I would start with now for sure at that. And I guess I feel like it could go all year. I mean, we get some pretty cold nights in June and July when it's rainy. So I would just apply that through the year, generally speaking. It's mostly going to be in the sheltering season, and I'd revisit next year.
Yeah, I agree.
Does that sound good? Anybody disagree?
We get some pretty bad weather in May, it seems, for sure, snow and things like that.
So it
The only
feels,
caveat has to be, we're making a request to Bridge House.
Exactly, yeah.
We can't tell them what to do. So it sounds like Isabel needs to take this to her board. It sounds like they may be sympathetic, but
Well-
they have capacity.
and then there's a resources part to this too.
Right.
And I guess the only other caveat is that we monitor it closely because we want to also the investment in the new culture change to also be successful. So we're going for two goals here.
And we're coming back in June with an update on all of this, so there'll be an opportunity to assess.
Okay.
I just want to say that the charts that you provided with the nightly sheltering was very helpful. Thank you.
Yep, more of that will be very helpful. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, and yeah, let me echo the thanks to the shelter for going through all this with us, and well, and the Bridge House too, with the whole new strategy. And I know it's been a bit arduous, but I think we're hopeful that it's taking us to a good place. Is that good for you?
Okay.
All right, thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
And thank you as well. I will be departing this evening, and you'll be advised by Deputy City Attorney Aaron Poe, I'm sorry, who will be working with the Housing Division on this.
Great. Thank you all.
So let me introduce Kurt Fernhaber, the Deputy Director of Housing, and Jeff Yegian, Senior Project Manager, who will present the Housing Board update.
Good evening. I'm also joined by Kristen Heiser, who, from the Division of Housing, that oversees a lot of our funding aspects and supports the TRG and CDAC that you'll learn a little bit more about. So when we presented this to you on December 5th, it was a little bit of a short preparation schedule in that the community wasn't really tuned into that topic that night. So we're going to go over a few of the aspects that we went over on that night as well for the benefit of bringing everyone up to speed. Jeff is going to be doing the presentation tonight. Jeff has done the bulk share of the work in preparation for this study session.
Good evening, everyone. Nice to see you again. We're going to just try and keep it to about 15 minutes of an overview of mostly what was in the memo for the benefit of those watching at home or on the recorded version, and provide a few updates to that information as possible. The way we organize the information and the thought process to bring you the draft ordinance that you requested is up on the screen. We reviewed a number of existing conditions and then made some assumptions about why we would want to create a housing advisory board, what it would do, and what types of experience and perspectives we would want to see represented on it as a way of preparing a draft for you to consider tonight. So I'm going to go through each of those briefly, and certainly if you have questions about the content, feel free to ask, and we do have 3 study session questions for you, as is our practice. We have prepared a draft purpose statement to describe why what this will do for our community when created, what the functions of it, what the Housing Advisory Board could and should be, and then what perspectives, experience, expertise, types of contributions you want people to be able to make that are appointed to the board. So we started with the city charter. As City Attorney Tom Carr pointed out in December, there are charter provisions that govern the creation of advisory boards and commissions. And currently there are 20. About half are more purely advisory and half are more technical in nature. For the most part, unless otherwise enshrined in the charter, they have 5 members, 5-year terms, monthly meetings, although often they do take a break in the summer. And the advisory boards, for the most part, are making recommendations to inform city council decisions. As we mentioned before, there are a number of bodies that already support the city's pretty extensive housing efforts. There are 7 that we outline here and in the memo. Planning Board covers development projects, land use policies that affect the production of housing, and what kinds of housing policies that define what is developed. And you have also relied on them for advice on a number of uses of housing and their recommendations on things like the co-op ordinance and others. The Technical Review Group is our Division of Housing Committee that provides recommendations to the city manager on funding applications for affordable housing projects and programs. They govern the Affordable Housing Fund, which is cash in lieu and other sources, as well as the CHAP and to a lesser extent our home dollars and some CDBG funds. The Home Consortium is a regional collaboration that covers all of Boulder and Broomfield counties that organizes the distribution and uses of the federal home program, which runs about $1.25–1.3 million a year. Community Development Advisory Committee, which is our longest standing committee, makes recommendations to the city manager on the use of community development block grant funds for housing programs, capital needs of nonprofits, public services. Home Ownership Committee is a division of Housing Committee. It advises staff on the implementation and administration of our home ownership program with about 800 permanently affordable units. The Homeless Strategy Board is a regional, countywide effort to coordinate and align resources with the countywide homelessness strategy. So that is a fairly new board and is, as you're aware, is working on the issues we were just talking about. And then lastly, the Boulder Housing Partners Commissioners are appointed by the mayor with advice from council. They govern the City of Boulder Housing Authority, which is our largest provider of permanently affordable housing in Boulder.
Do we want to ask questions as we go or get to the end first?
You cool? As long as they're really like clarifying and not delving deep? Yeah.
Well, so as I look at this group, I'm sure that these have different levels of responsibility and influence, right? And so would I be correct in thinking that the technical review group is a very important one of this list?
We rely on them heavily. They are a committee which is composed of people primarily with specific expertise that we have determined is important to advise the city on making funding decisions, specific funding decisions. So they have technical ability in evaluating the feasibility of projects, the appropriateness and adequacy of the subsidy that's provided, and the benefit that's created. So a fairly specific technical expertise there.
And so they provide advice for 4 funding cycles during the year plus opportunities, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, so it's fairly heavy lift. And about how many dollars would you say that they recommend each year and give you advice on?
The range would be 3 to 10 or 11 million in a year. The average is 5 to 6.
Okay. And then the home consortium, if you were to stick a budget number on what is it $1 million a year?
1.3. So it's declining.
Okay. And then the community development for the block grants, how much is that a year? Okay, so we got like 6 and 1 and 1. And then the homeownership committee, now my understanding from conversations was that there hasn't been as much activity in homeownership. Is that right or wrong? Or
The activity is somewhat different in that they review and help develop the administrative policies for the programs, and they hear exception requests and make recommendations to the Deputy Director of Housing on whether there should be an exception made to a policy. They do meet regularly. I don't know the total hours that they would provide. It would probably be in between the TRG and the CDAC.
Okay, and the Homeless Strategy Board, and then that's the county board. There's also this affordable housing group that's gathering at the county level, right? So how do those really influence what goes on with our housing program?
Are you speaking of the regional? Okay, so that board is actually in the midst of being created, probably over the next, possibly within this quarter, but certainly by next quarter. And it's looking like it will be broadly represented by some of the cities, like City of Boulder Division of Housing, Longmont Housing, the housing authorities, and then others within the community that are stakeholders, which could represent nonprofits. It could represent chambers, so a variety of interests, that have a larger interest in affordable housing. It will be a larger board. I think 15 is the number that's being targeted right now.
And Kurt, just while you're talking about that, is that envisioned the city representatives being city staff, city electeds, both? What?
At this point, it would be city staff, although I think there's 3 sub committees, one of May, which have elected representation.
Okay, thank you.
And then the last group is the Housing Partners Commissioners. Are your conversations with them mostly about projects where you're looking at how much can we put in versus what can you do with how does that look and work and feel?
It normally wouldn't be project specific. It would be more at a strategic level. The project specific interaction would be at a staff level, and then the BHP staff would obviously have to, they meet regularly with their commissioners about specific projects.
Okay, so how does, when you say strategic level, what would a venue be where the commissioners and housing got together, and what would the discussion look like?
So we, as lead staff, Kurt and I, over the years, have met with the commissioners directly on their strategic planning efforts. We have regular meetings with staff and occasionally meet with their commissioners as desired. You want to add?
Yeah. And they will often invite us for a strategic discussion, or, you know, the start of the year, or, you know, something like that. But I would say that they're certainly independent of us.
Yeah, of course, they're totally their own thing. They're our housing authority. I was just curious, when you say strategic, I would imagine, like, okay, we have this much money that we can pool and these opportunities that we can do. Where on the ground would we want to look at that? But you're saying it's not really so much where on the ground, it's higher level.
That's correct.
All right.
Yeah, and that we will also listen to them. They'll give input around policies and approaches that we're taking as well.
Okay, we have Mary and Lisa, and, yeah. But let's keep.
Are any of these governed by the charter membership limits that you stated
No.
earlier? No?
None of these are, none of these have been established by ordinance. None of them are advisory to council directly, with the exception of planning board, which is in the charter.
And have you ever kind of stepped back and looked at all of these different committees and considered a merger where something like that might make sense?
So each of them, we have three that would be within the purview of the Division of Housing, and we do periodically assess what functions they fill and whether there are opportunities to look at them differently. Each time we've said, no, these each have a discrete set of responsibilities, a discrete set of expertise that we're trying to use community volunteers to support the city's efforts.
Thank you.
If I could just add something to that, when it comes to the Home Consortium, so the Home Consortium does go beyond the City of Boulder's boundaries, and so goes beyond the City of Boulder's boundaries, and so we are pooling home funds with Longmont, Boulder County, as well as Broomfield. The Home Consortium members, which are made up of city staff members from Longmont, Boulder County, and Broomfield, do vet projects that then go to the TRG. So there is cross-coordination between those two groups when it comes to making funding decisions using those home dollars. So there is some cross-collaboration there.
Okay, Lisa? Yeah, I just wanted to point out that none of these, except for the planning board, are appointed by city council, so they're all answered to the city manager. So these are a lot of groups. So are these public meetings, and are these listed their time of meeting? I've never seen them. I know Kristen has said they're in, but I've never seen them in what we advertise for our boards and commissions. So what's the opportunity for the public to come and watch these discussions?
Sure.
And could they be more public, and can we have them more listed so people of interest could go and attend these meetings?
Sure. So we do publicize, all of our meetings can be public, are public, and they're publicized on the city's website, as well as we put public notices in the Daily Camera. And we have a listing of about 200 partners that have either received funding previously or just have contacted us with an interest in funding. We send out blast emails letting them know when there's a fund round occurring. With that said, we just entered this year, we are moving towards a quarterly fund round in order to provide greater transparency and predictability to our partner, or for our partners and the community. And so at the beginning of each year, we'll send out a funding notice saying, hey, these are the deadlines for meeting these 4 opportunities, our funding application opportunities, and then all of that will be public on our website, as well as we're gonna start, and we've notified our partners of this, that all applications will be posted on the website. So whenever we receive a funding application, those will be available on the website for review too. The public is invited to attend our meetings, and It depends on the size of the meeting, what we're anticipating. Usually they are held in our, near our offices in the atrium. However, we have had, in recent situations, we did consider holding a meeting actually here in chambers because we were expecting a possible turnout. So it really is, varies depending on the topic to be discussed. I will say that, so all of that is public. There are times.
Could council get the notices? That would
of
be
course.
helpful. We don't right now.
Okay.
Can you pause and, I'm sorry, can you remind us who you are? And when you say our, are you speaking on who?
So I'm Kristen Heiser. I'm sorry I didn't introduce myself, but I thought Kurt had. But,
anyhow,
and I'm
I'm
the
sorry.
Community Investment Program Manager with the Division of Housing. The team that I manage oversees all of the funding and compliance for the Division of Housing.
So when you say our, are you speaking on behalf of, when you said like when we have a funding cycle?
The Division of Housing's funding cycles.
Which involves how many of these?
It involves the Technical Review Group, Home Consortium, CDAC, and that's those three.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just drill into the notice? This is just a direct follow-up, Lisa, if you don't mind. That we talk about notice in the paper. Like I always look at the Section A notice, right? And other than planning board, I don't think these make it in the Section A notice.
We could expand that. We do put public notices.
This is just a question. I'm not
Okay.
asking for a change. It's a
Yeah.
question. So is this then, but are all of these in the, like, back in the classifieds, page 3?
Mm-hmm.
But they all are, like every single one?
Particularly, I can assert that the federal funding applications always are because we're required to do that. Where I would like to go with the conversation is there are times where, because of the nature of a funding request, confidentiality and agility to move quickly is required to be able to work with our partners to be able to provide them funding in certain circumstances. In those situations, we do not post them on our website because of confidentiality issues or just because we can't meet the timing requirements. So there have been situations where we have to make a funding recommendation and go to the city manager within days, and that gets in the way of some of the public noticing.
So I'm going to we have to get back to the presentation.
Right, but
Okay.
I just want to ask, and I think you alluded, you could do that. Could these meetings, I mean, we know when the planning board meets, we know when BHP meets, people can go to all those meetings, and I will say that council does appoint one or all of them, all the BHPs. So those are appointed by, but it would be really helpful if those were in the Section A notices.
That's not a question. Okay, that's a fine point. We're going back to your presentation. We have lots of input to give you. I just want to try to get us through this.
Another way we prepared the draft ordinance was to review the research we did a couple of years ago on housing boards around the country. There were 10 of them that are detailed in the attachment to the memo, attachment B, but we found pretty significant variation in their functions. They advise councils and commissions, so elected officials, they advise staff, they advise mayors. So there's no common, predominant way that they're set up. We did find the majority of them are mixed with expert members as well as at-large or lay members. Some are all expert and some are non-expert as well. So while most have experts on them, not all have specific membership qualifications. We also did a little bit of community outreach and requests for input. I think we were fairly successful in reaching interested parties with the time we had. We had 2 public meetings attended by almost 50 people between them, and then received over 100 responses to an online questionnaire. I hope you had a chance to click through to see those. All those responses are posted, as well as a summary of the commonalities to the extent that there were. What we heard from those and a few conversations that people reached out directly in emails was certainly there was no, I wouldn't characterize any of this as a majority opinion of the community feedback. So these are more themes and that had enough resonance with enough people to stand out. And in this case, I've listed some of those that the board should really have a clear purpose. It really should be a tool and a resource that helps us do more faster. That it should be a higher level board that really focuses on strategies, policies, priorities, and that the membership should be balanced. There needs to be, due to the type of issues and the complexity of some of the policy choices, housing expertise does make a difference in those, and we have heard that from former participants of Housing Task Force from several years ago, if you remember that, as well as a need for general perspective at large, people who care about our community and are willing to participate with others in furthering our efforts. Some diversity, open-mindedness, creativity, innovation were themes that we heard across the board. And then one thing that was of particular interest was the desire to have some people advising you or with the rest of the board members that have really struggled with housing affordability at times in their life. And you'll see in the proposed or the draft ordinance that we are implementing that in one way by recommending that a renter be involved in as a member of the board. So I won't go over all of these, but we sorted several of the responses into how people should approach this work and what kind of life experience or other experience might be helpful. We took all of that and we made some assumptions in order to craft the purpose, functions, and composition proposal that you have. And I've mentioned some of them, that this should not be a duplicative board. It shouldn't replace anyone else. It should be additive. It should create a new resource for us to further our efforts. Innovation, creativity, whether it's coming from the community or from national research, how can we do new and more things to accomplish our goals was a theme there, an assumption that we're making. That the focus should be on policy making, an assumption, and not program operations, and that it would be beneficial if there were funding recommendations or priorities that came out of this board's work, but that actual funding decisions are best made at the recommendations made by the TRG, which is dedicated to this and doesn't have as broad a focus as a housing board will. So with those assumptions, we drafted a purpose statement for your review and input. If you wanted to formalize something along these lines, it would be probably formalized in the bylaws rather than of the Housing Advisory Board rather than in the ordinance itself. But it could be done that way, I believe. We'd want to think that one through a little with the City Attorney's Office. Yep.
So I understand that affordability is one big challenge with housing, maybe the biggest. It seems like there might be others as well, which include diversity and diversity of housing types and so on. So is there a reason you focus just on affordability here rather than kind of the full spectrum of potential challenges?
Yes, and this is, I guess, another assumption we made, which is the primary discussions and policy choices that you make and you ask for our support with have to do with affordability. That is repeatedly the highest priority issue that people mention when talking about housing. Overall land use patterns and decisions are really already covered by the planning board. And so what types of housing can be created? There's certainly some overlap there when you get into things like the current discussion around ADUs. And you'll see later that we acknowledge that there's overlap between Planning Board and the Housing Advisory Board and recommend a way to approach that. There could be other issues like compatible development, smart regs, some of the ones that you mentioned. So it could certainly be have a broader mandate. We took the approach of saying, giving it some focus around the affordability challenges. So the list of functions that we put into the draft ordinance came out of a lot of the input that we had from the community, from the research we did. We looked at what functions other city advisory boards have, what other housing boards around the country do, and took a list and started massaging it to come up with this proposal for your consideration. We look forward to getting your advice on and direction on how you would like to shape it. It's certainly something that could take all kinds of different forms, but these are the ones that we thought would be a good starting point for your discussion. In looking at the functions of the board, it's clear that if we're to avoid duplication, we need to have some clear divisions of responsibility with the other groups in the city that support the city's efforts. But there are certain key relationships between a housing advisory board and other committees and groups that need more than just some words that describe different roles. So we're proposing that you consider for the three Division of Housing Committees, the Technical Review Group, Community Development Advisory Committee, and the Homeownership Committee, that you sign off on an operating approach that would have them providing information and really updates and reports on their activities to the Housing Advisory Board, and in return getting advice and around aligning the work at the policy level and the recommendations that the Housing Board is making with the decisions, programmatic decisions that the three committees are making. So that's on the left side. On the right side, the importance of having coordination between the efforts and discussions at the Planning Board and the Housing Advisory Board led us to propose two approaches. One would be parallel to what is done with landmarks, in which the Planning Board appoints a non-voting member to that advisory board to enable collaboration and coordination. Alternatively, if that is asking perhaps a lot of added responsibility for the Planning Board, the chair of the committee or the Housing Advisory Board could regularly report to and request any kind of discussions to Planning Board, were the two ideas that we had around how to help that relationship be strengthened. So. Moving on to the composition of the board, what we did here over and over was multiple perspectives are very important. We landed on a starting point for you to consider 2 community members at large with no specific experience or requirements, 3 community members with relevant professional experience without determining exactly which kind of professional experience they would have, so that they could support with their experience and expertise, the discussions of the policy questions that they'll be asked to provide recommendations on. In part, that is based on the technicality of some of these, and in part, it's based on the experience of housing boards around the country, which are predominantly or in some cases exclusively using people with professional experience, direct professional experience, often with particular experiences required, such as owner-operator of affordable housing, or developer, or realtor, or a user, a resident. We thought that based on the feedback we've been getting that this would provide some balance and provide a group of members who could support each other in providing the best possible advice and recommendations to you. And we did include that one of the members at least one should probably be a renter based on the community feedback. So we outline a quick timeline. We heard you in December. We did put in a notice that this was a board that was likely to be formed with the standard boards and commissions recruitment. I heard that we have at least a dozen people who've expressed interest in this board if you do create it. So we outlined in this that we could probably bring you an ordinance, depending on your feedback tonight, for first reading in February and hopefully second reading in March, at your meeting in March. Recruitment with clarity around who you would like to appoint could begin. The constraints on that are primarily your ability to interview folks and your desire for, and the desire you might have for a length of time by which people would have to apply once we open formal applications, and then whether you want to weigh in on the questions that are on the applications. So if those all are, depending on the answers to those, we believe we could provide you with a slate of, or you could receive applications and review them and interview them in time to appoint board members in April. It's conceivable it could go quicker depending on your availability and desires there. And then we're projecting that we could get started with meetings in May and June. Lastly, we've started to collect suggestions that we've heard, ideas for potential work plan items. If you seat a board in April or around then, what would they start working on? Here are some of the suggestions that we've heard. We could certainly, to the extent you want us to, bring you some, when you consider an ordinance, that's something that you could also consider if you want, or we could wait until the board is seated and begin working on them in the early days with a work plan for their term. All right, so we had 3 questions outlined in the memo. I don't know if anyone has questions on the content, or do you want to dive into discussion?
I'm sure we have a ton. Show us the 3 questions again, though.
All right, feedback on the purpose statement, feedback on the functions, and then feedback on the composition of the board. Those
Okay.
are the,
You just have broad questions? But I think,
A question, and then I'm happy to start answering.
all right, then, okay.
So if we go back to your wheel of all the people who are participating currently in housing decisions, the 2 boards that council does have some oversight over, the planning board and BHP, do the TRG, the CDAC, and Home Ownership Committee, do they weigh in? Do they ever update planning board or BHP?
not currently.
And is there a reason for that?
So all of these are really supporting the staff program operations efforts. So they are internal to the city in that regard. We have, at some level, we have tried to preserve some objectivity. So building a relationship between the members of the TRG and the BHP commissioners could be perceived as, or even lead to, certainly would lead to a different level of understanding for their projects when they come forward. So if we were to do that, we would probably want to figure a way to do it with others that apply to help us meet our housing goals.
I mean, what I was asking specifically is a lot of times we'll have something in front of us, and then we'll have a planning board recommendation and other boards' recommendations. And I'm just wondering, the planning board makes some large decisions. Sometimes they might be well served by having input from these other boards.
So I think their scope is a little bit different. Like the Home Ownership Committee is working at a much lower level. A particular homeowner will do a request to them, so they'll look at sort of at that sort of micro level, and then they really look at sort of the internal. They give feedback on sort of the internal policies within the Division of Housing related to home ownership. I'm not sure that that's really. I'm not sure how relevant that is to Planning Board or BHP. The Home Consortium, that's, it's sort of a different animal as well, because it's more of a regional, HUD-required process.
Okay, that's good. So I'm happy to go into the
I'd like to follow up on the question, if that's all right. So I think I understand that most of the groups wouldn't have much to say to the planning board. There would not be a lot there. It seems to me, however, just following up on Lisa's thought, the technical review group has a really interesting role. I mean, it advises, I think, on a quarterly basis plus opportunity, right? And so opportunities obviously have to move fast. But, you know, I served on the planning board. It would have been very interesting to understand how all the funding pieces fit together, because there's the tax credit piece, there's the, you know, what comes from the housing department itself for the opportunities. And so I assume that for things like Tantra and for the Osage rehab, that the technical review group was involved with those decisions, right? I think it would be interesting if they debriefed somebody about those decisions outside of the housing department, because I think one of the things that we're hearing is this is kind of a murky process, but it's, you know, big dollars and it results in good things for the community. I mean, Tantra's a great success. All those Osage and Thunderbird work is great success. But I think whatever happens with the board that we're talking about now, I think the planning board would benefit from understanding that a little better. I didn't understand it very well when I was on the planning board, and that's just something that I think, generally speaking, increasing the literacy of our community, particularly the boards that work on this, couldn't hurt a thing.
I think we would be glad to do that.
Oh, I'm sorry, Mary, and then me. In terms of questions.
Yeah, there's a slide there that's got planning board to HAB or HAB to planning board, the ex officio representation. It seems to me like there's a very subtle difference between each of the two ways to go. Could you elaborate a little bit on the differences there?
Sure. The model we started with was landmarks, where planning board appoints a non-voting member that participates in all the landmarks meetings. That makes a bunch of sense. It's also a significant additional responsibility for a board that already has a lot of work. So in thinking about that, we thought, well, what's an alternative if that were to be something that planning board felt like was a little much, or council, you appoint planning board as well and set their work program to some extent. That an alternative to establish a stronger relationship between these two boards would be to have the chair of the Housing Advisory Board regularly go to planning board. So it's a question of where the work is and what direction the information is flowing. In both, it should be two-way, but in the first, it's planning board participating in the work of the committee, a planning board member. In the second, it's more an agenda item on planning board's meeting and then discussion. That's how I'd characterize the difference. And there are certainly other ways to do it. Those are the two that we thought worthy of putting up for you to consider, but.
My question just has to do with size and our limitations on it having just 5.
So
if we wanted it to be a little bigger,
yep.
What are our options?
So our general default rule in the charter is 5 voting members. One option would be to have the 5 and then have a ballot item changing the charter to be able to have more. That's how PRAB has 7 members. Or you could have non-voting members, like the planning board chair or, BHP representative, and expand it that way.
Okay, so it's really just voting members. Okay, any more questions, and we'll launch into, let's do them one at a time, though. Can we just start with the function or the purpose?
Could I ask one more question?
Yeah.
Please. Where you recommended that at least one of the members be a renter, did you consider putting criteria beyond that? Say, for example, a renter in a certain income level or situational circumstance?
So the most common comment we have is that it should be a market rate renter because of the challenges of the market for renters right now. Others suggested it should be someone who is renting in an affordable unit. Some of the boards around the country require that it be a Section 8 renter. we thought that the renter perspective was important, but didn't choose to recommend that it be more constrained than that.
Okay, first question. Purpose statement. Lisa, Jill, Sam. So I'm fine pretty much with this, except I don't want to limit it just to affordability. Certainly, affordability should be a huge chunk of the discussion, but at least my intention of this board is to get the community talking more about housing and housing solutions, housing types, so there is better understanding of housing, better understanding of what our challenges are, and dialogue between different neighborhoods, different people with different perspectives. And so I'm fine with having affordability in there, but it cannot be just affordability. It needs to also include housing in general. And how you want to phrase that, I don't have a strong opinion. I like how you have your little circle functional coordination, where you have HAB, or you have TRG, CDAC, and HOC informing and reporting to HAB, and then HAB advising and aligning. And so I like that circle, just so that the Housing Advisory Board is in tune with the funding challenges and opportunities, and it becomes conversant in housing lingo and funding, because it's, as we all know, it's pretty complicated, and there's all different types of housing. So I think I'm fine with the draft purpose, as long as it includes this functional coordination, as well as more than just affordability. So I'm not going to wordsmith. You can figure that out.
Some of us might want to. Okay, Jill.
Yeah. Yeah, I actually agree with Lisa on that, and largely because I think that affordability could be interpreted as our IH program and our deed-restricted homes, and we have so many housing types that provide affordable options that are not in that. And so how do you categorize all those, whether it be a mobile home, an ADU, a co-op, even the conversation we had about split lots, some people saw 800 as a good missing middle range, and some people thought it was, totally unaffordable. So I think she's right. We need to broaden that. I'm really concerned, every other housing board or the planning that the city council votes on, so planning board and BOZA and anyone touching housing, is really rooted in some kind of document, right? Like planning board's interpreting our code. So I'm concerned that this is a little bit rootless, and the comp plan really is the guiding document. So when we say the city's housing goals, I'd love to see something along the lines of rooted in the Boulder Valley Comprehensive Plan, just so that there's those clear guiding principles of what our housing goals are. And they're not making up new housing goals. We actually have really clear housing goals. They're coming up with ways to meet those.
Yeah, I like that idea.
Sam.
I guess for me, I like the way it reads, but I would take affordability out so that it would say responses to Boulder's housing challenges and accelerate progress towards the city's housing goals. I'm kind of ambivalent as to whether we call out the comp plan here or not, because the comp plan is kind of our guiding overall document. If we want to, that's fine. But I also think that we have other housing goals that we've set out, like the 10%, permanently affordable, and then the new 5% goals. And I don't think those are necessarily in the comp plan in that way. I don't think so, but I could be wrong. So there's also other places that we've set goals as a city. So I think as a vision statement, this might be just good enough, but I would take affordability out of it, because I'm concerned about diversity as well as affordability, and that people have good equal opportunities, and that we are developing the right stock with, and this is where I think housing can inform planning, right? It's like if Housing Advisory Board sees a challenge with some kinds of zoning, they could tell that to Planning Board and say, actually, it would help us if there were a land use fix that went along with these other housing goals. So I think I really do like the link, and it's going far afield, that you've created with Planning Board.
Aaron.
So I think you wrote a great statement. I think it's very sharply written. But I'll agree with different pieces of what's been said, that I think having a mandate beyond affordability, I think makes sense. But different from Sam, I would keep the word in there because I think that is our most critical challenge with housing. So I wouldn't want to just drop it and say, well, we have lots of challenges and they're all, so I would keep affordability in there. So it makes, maybe it makes the wording a little less great, but something in there that,
Aaron?
like Lisa was going towards.
Could you go for something like housing challenges, including affordability?
Yeah, something like that.
Well, and to me, okay, I'm going, are you done with yours?
I had a little bit more.
On this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
So that was on that particular language. And then just I thought what Jill said made sense to me because we do have, I don't know if we put it here or if it's in the secondary paragraph or something, but in addition to the comp plan, which I think does have our percentage goal into, and we just altered it this year to say 10 or more. I forget the language we chose, but then also like the middle income housing strategy that's adopted. So I would want to make sure that the housing board was moving in accordance with our adopted goals and plans. So whether that goes in this statement or whether it's in some like next paragraph, that explains their mission, I think that's a good thing to include.
Wait, you lost me on that one. You want goals and plans?
Well,
you want to actually
to just that make explicit that they should be carrying out our various adopted goals and plans, and that could go here or it could go in an explanatory thing afterwards in their kind of commission.
Okay, I'll just throw in there. I'm agreeing, sort of trending towards where Aaron's heading. I think we should list, if we want to expand, we should. But I think taking things out makes things more vague. Let's add stuff in if we want to be more specific. So I think affordability is a huge one. But if we want to say diversity and accessibility as kind of the three challenges, then I would say them because I think that clarifies.
I guess for me, just having affordability be the only one is the only challenge I had. If you want to add it so there's a few, and we understand there's even others beyond those, that's fine.
But those are the big ones that I think we have, right? Other thoughts on this? Who hasn't spoken?
I just had a question for you, Suzanne. You mentioned accessibility, and what do you mean by that? Are you meaning accessibility to people with disabilities? Are you accessibility?
That's a good question. I was being kind of loose about it. I mean, just because I think affordability, I mean, we're looking at, for instance, the shared equity model, which doesn't mean the house is affordable, but you're providing accessibility for people into housing. So you could mean it that way. It's tools to make it accessible, even if it's really expensive. It could also mean literally accessible to all, I guess.
Yeah, I think both definitions would be good here because I was thinking more along the lines of things like universal design, things like that.
Well, that's true, except for this. Do we think this advisory board is going to be dealing with design? Or
well,
just
in
more,
terms of, housing types, if you add diversity, I think that's
but
part
okay.
of it.
I like the idea of policy and types. Well, I don't want these people to have to review design, but.
I mean, I think diversity also has two meanings, right? There's diversity of housing types, and there's the diversity of the population that can access those types. So, I mean, I actually like leaving it vague in that way because there's multiple meanings of each of them.
Agree.
Okay. So, does anybody, what I heard is adding those two other things, and maybe either if we're just going to make it one paragraph, housing goals and plans. If there's a second paragraph, you can add lots more.
Well, I think with respect to Jill's point, which I like about adding, making sure that it's rooted in some sort of document, I think that there are various documents that have bits and pieces, so maybe saying something to the effect of relevant documents or something like that.
Okay, anything else on this?
Well, I don't know, I guess that's the next question.
Lisa, microphone there.
I hate this situation. I'll wait for the next question because it's the feedback on the functions of the
Okay,
housing board.
we'll go to that next. Is that good enough on the purpose? Okay. Okay, good. So where do we get at the who sits on whose board part?
Next question.
That's the third
next
one? Okay, so we're dealing with function stuff.
Can I ask a clarification question on this one? What do you mean in the second point by legislation as opposed to state and federal advocacy? We don't usually call, say, what the city council does legislating. What did you have in mind there?
Right, so the full statement is study, prepare, and recommend to the council long and short-range priorities, specific legislation, probably and mostly going to be ordinances that you as a council would pass, funding priorities and programs to alleviate affordable housing problems. So that's how we drafted it. We couldn't fit it, we didn't want to fit all 6 and jam them in a small font, but.
So in that case, legislation means local ordinances.
Yes. And then there's the last one there is to advise you as council on appropriate advocacy roles for state and federal legislation.
Gotcha. Just, do we want to consider the word ordinances rather than legislation? I just always think of legislation as a state and federal thing.
That's good.
Also, I'm curious, it sounds, you have number one, I want to make sure that we've now kind of corrected, we're not going to be just talking about affordable housing. So through all of this, we're going to have a variety of different housing, including affordable housing.
Okay. Let's pause there for a second. And when we say affordable, we mean permanently affordable and market rate, correct? Or do we want to state that? Market rate affordable.
Probably worth stating in some place, if not the purpose.
Is that what you were getting
Yeah,
at?
I just want to make sure we have as broad of a bandwidth on housing so this community can talk about housing, which we haven't done.
Okay, well, so that's the dialogue piece, but in terms of the definition of do people want to expand to be very clear? It's both permanently affordable and market rate affordable we're talking about?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I suppose, because market rate affordable is what's eroding. I mean, the problem with saying market rate affordable is how long will it be affordable and to whom? And that's always my challenge with it. If we're talking about shedding 900 homes a year from affordability, and that's a point that people like to keep bringing up, then market rate affordable, I would just leave it as affordable and not get specific about that, because things like mobile homes, I believe, will often stay affordable for a long period of time. But things that are on the bubble, like homes in South Boulder, may move out of affordability fairly quickly.
I just meant that, okay, let me put it another way. Some people, when they see this, think we're only talking about deed restricted. And I think we're talking about more than deed restricted. So I just meant to make sure that we're clear, this board is going to advise on beyond just deed restricted.
Yes.
That's what I meant.
Sure. And I was going to make a concrete suggestion, just following up on this on number 4, similar to what we did in the purpose statement. Consider impacts of policies on housing affordability, diversity, and accessibility. Something like that to make it clear it's beyond, but we name the things we care about.
Yep. Okay, that's good.
So
Jill?
I never got my question, which is, it was,
sorry.
why do we have coordinate regional housing efforts when there's going to be a regional housing board?
That's
Why
my
is-
question, word for word.
So
Well, we have telephone right here.
that's shorthand for the full statement function, which would be to advise the city council on regional housing issues and the implementation of regional housing efforts.
Per the city of Boulder, or, I mean, how is there not going to be overlap between what's forming and right now?
So there could be overlap, and depending on how it's implemented. I think the point here was to advise the city council. I mean, the city council is actually a key stakeholder in the regional plan and the regional strategy. I think to take this housing advisory board out of that discussion, saying you don't give input on the regional approach, it's really, again, it's advising the city council.
No, I just wanted to understand why it was in there, because I was confused.
It doesn't have the role of the regional.
Okay.
I think it's to advise us how we should be playing ball in those regional.
That's correct.
Yeah, and I'm fine with that.
Is that cool? Anything?
I just comment because I think that's an important clarification, and I guess I would say number 3, evaluate and advise council on innovative approaches. Number 5, advise on regional housing coordination and efforts. I mean, I think that makes it really clear that that's
more than
coordinated. And this is an advisory board.
Right.
Yeah.
Aaron?
Yeah, I'll agree with that, because their role isn't to go out to the region and coordinate all the regional efforts, right? It's to advise, and, so that, I think that's a good point. One thing I wanted to bring up is, at the retreat, we had a good conversation on how this board might help with mobile home issues and maintaining affordability and sustainability of mobile home parks and their residents. And I wonder if that's worth getting in here somewhere. Do we want to call that out explicitly, or how do we make that known that that's something we'd like them to work on?
Well, Erin, that showed up as one of the first work items, proposed work items. So I actually think it's covered, but.
Yeah, if everybody else is comfortable that I know it's in the work item, but if we don't need to mention it here, that's fine. I just thought I'd mention it. We might want to consider putting it here, but it's fine if we don't need to.
I think the diversity piece in the definitions covers it.
Okay, good deal.
Did you have your hand up?
No, I think I'm good.
Okay. Anything else on this one?
Were there any expectations that aren't covered by this list of functions? If this is what your housing board does for you, is it sufficient?
Well, I'm
with the as modified by your comments already.
I think it would be great if we had somebody doing this.
Yeah, no, I like this, but, I'm hoping that, and I just have written down some things, that they could advise us on infill programs, so like co-ops, ADUs, those kinds of things. Funding, so down payment assistance, other things, types of housing, that might work in various neighborhoods. And of course, you want to look at the sub-community and the neighborhood to see if that can be supported. I think other functions would be review our affordable housing approaches, review our middle income housing programs and approaches. And what are other communities doing? What kind of innovations are other communities doing? What are their successes? What have been their downsides? I'd like them to look at that. And just the types of housing, and maybe looking at perhaps zoning, not actually doing planning board things, but looking at so this area, anyway, I don't want to belabor the point, but maybe having the opportunity to having a discussion on zoning, and I'll get to why that might help. Once we get to the board composition, I have some ideas, and I'd like to speak to that first.
So I guess one of my questions about that long list you just made is whether we need to spell out all that stuff, or does diversity capture, do we have to list all, ADUs, co-ops, mobile homes, blah, or are we good if we, because once you start listing, then you got to be comprehensive.
Right.
In reviewing the other boards that councils have created, the clear approach in the ordinances that create their functions and enable them is to provide a general outline of the responsibilities. For example, TAB does not talk about, Transportation Advisory Board does not talk about all the different strategies and tools that we are trying to use, in part because that list would get really long, and in part because we can't anticipate all the emerging issues over the next 20 to 30 years that this board will be working for you. So I would say, to be consistent with how most of the boards are set up, you take a more general approach such as these.
I would think the word innovative covers everything that Lisa said.
Okay, so we're done with this one, we're going to 3?
No.
No, we're not.
Just that I think it is covered here. Advise on strategies, goals, policies, all of, it all covers that. And just that, like you said, I think we get enough.
Okay.
The one thing I want to add, and I don't know if you want to add a line here, but I think one of the things that we want the Housing Advisory Board to do is be really well informed about what the TRG and the other two groups are doing. And to the extent, and you drew it in your little diagram, to advise on what the Housing Advisory Board thinks the priorities are. And then the TRG can consider that with everything else they need to when they're looking at funding. So I almost think it needs to be here because it's to coordinate with the other housing technical groups.
Yeah,
And
those
whether
three.
you call it out or not, it just doesn't seem to fit into any of the buckets that are there.
Well, I don't know why it's just those 3, though. Shouldn't they be, why would they only coordinate with those other 2? Why not? I mean, they're coordinating on regional stuff, are they not? They'd be meeting with the planning board anyhow. Why would we limit it just to the technical ones?
Well, we can say whatever ones we want. They coordinate with planning board as well. But those 3 specifically, they don't coordinate with anybody right now except for the housing department. So it's a change in perspective that they would do that.
There's one other thing that we could add, but this is a question, is they serve a role in elevating the community dialogue and adding transparency to the community discussion around housing. That is not how I would say that, but anyhow, that concept is that this would help connect the dots for people. Anyhow, so that I would hope by appointing this board and then holding these conversations that would be a result. So I could almost list it as a function, if you guys agreed.
Increase transparency.
Well, I'm not sure if I haven't figured out the right way to say it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can wordsmith it, but you understand the idea. I think they go hand in hand. What Zan said as far as bringing the function of those groups out a little more, I think planning board's already well understood by the community, but those other groups are kind of less part of the discussion right now.
And can I ask a clarifying question as we launch into this next one? And if
Well, I
you want
just
to
wanna-
finish out this one.
Let's finish that one out.
Yep.
So I think it's somehow to bring transparency and coordination amongst all the elements in the community involved in housing decisions and engaging the community in that.
I really liked what you said about elevating the conversation, too. My hope is that this board doesn't serve to further politicize housing.
Right, yeah.
Okay, with that, we will go to 3.
Position.
And you had a question before Lisa goes?
Yeah, I had a question about less about this piece, but in terms of how they relate to other boards. What is your thought on issues where, because this board, we're talking about that they would recommend ordinances, for example, but ordinances might well be under Title IX, which is the purview of planning board, right, which has to make recommendations on that. Would you see this follow it like recommendation from housing board, then planning board, then council, or do you see another sequence to things that would overlap between the two bodies?
So in the event it were a Title IX question, it would need to go to planning board. On other issues, it's really a question of how you want advice to come to you as council. It would certainly, depending on the issue, if you go sequentially, you have a certain kind of advice. It was made here and then modified or elaborated on here, and it perhaps creates a sense of hierarchy. Or you could get it parallel. You could ask both boards to weigh in.
Okay, so let's have a discussion about this piece, but I'd like to come back to this question because I think it'll matter. So thanks for that.
Okay. Do you have a question or you?
I wanted to add to this
Okay.
piece of the conversation. So going back as to whether planning board goes to HAB or HAB goes to planning board, maybe add to this later conversation about whether or not both should occur for a period of time until things are established. And I'd like to talk about that.
Lisa. Okay, so I would like to just propose something and talk through it first and then get some legal advice. So what I would like to propose is that we have a 9-member board and that we basically have 5 members that serve and are voting members. Each one of them gets a staggered term, so one gets 1 year, 2 year, 3, 4, 5. Then we appoint 2, what will be, we hope, board members, but they would be they could participate, but they would be ex officio. And once we pass the ordinance in the fall, then they can become voting members.
And you mean charter ballot
Yeah,
measure?
charter, yeah. If it passes. And then, so there would be 7 members. The 8th member would be, I like the planning board ex officio being on there, and I want to discuss your idea. I think that could be helpful. And then I would like to get somebody from TRG to be an ex officio on this board, so that you bring that kind of expertise, somebody who's dealing with TRG. I mean, maybe you'd suggest CDAC, I don't know, but it seems like TRG kind of has most of the action. So, so that brings you to 9. So you have ultimately 7 voting members and 2 ex officios, one of which is from planning board and one which is from TRG or some kind of that kind of expertise. So is that legal?
Yes.
Okay.
I think we
So,
can make that work.
thank you. So I would like, in terms of requirements, I would like one of the people to be a renter. I would like one of the people to be a homeowner. And the rest of them, I think.
Huts.
Oh. And the rest of them would be like the planning board. They would apply, and they would have, different walks of expertise. They could be from real estate. They could be from a neighborhood. They could be from Section 8. But a broad section of people, and let the city council make the decision in terms of that diversity of people. Right now, we have planning board, almost my entire time on council, we have never had a assigned position for a planning board, but we almost always have had a design professional on the planning board. So anyway, I envision it in that way instead of saying it has to be 3 professionals. And one of the things I have with 3 professionals, we don't have 3 professionals on any other board, so that doesn't seem to go well. The council could appoint, and people are open to apply.
Lisa, I just want to ask Lisa a question about, I think that it could be helpful to have a person on the board that does not live in the city. A commuter or some other person that brings in a perspective outside of the bubble.
So I don't know if that's legal.
I have a feeling that they have to be a city resident to be a voting member. They could possibly be ex officio.
Could they be a lawyer? They deal with commuters. Is that what you're after?
I'm just still after a perspective that is outside of Boulder, is all.
We have Aaron and then Bob.
So, Lisa, thank you. I think that's a great proposal. I think it takes a lot of things into account. If I could just offer a couple suggested modifications and see what you think, and other people, was that I really like the idea of getting this on the ballot and doing a charter amendment and going to 7 people. One thing I think that's going to be a little bit of a logistical challenge is appointing a large board from scratch, as they're starting all at once. So I wonder if we might start with the 5, and then the charter change would then give us an opportunity to stagger a little bit and bring on the 2 other people next year if the charter change were approved. And so instead of having to appoint 7 people all at once, we could do 5 this year and 2 next year. But they would still get to that 7. And then I really like where you're going with the 2 ex officio members as well. In terms of composition, having a renter and a homeowner, I think, is good. We're talking about how there was feedback from the community about people who had, maybe struggled with their housing, and I think that is an important perspective. Having a renter doesn't necessarily reflect that. I mean, there are plenty of renters who are fairly comfortable. They face different challenges than homeowners do, but not everybody is struggling. So I think it's worth considering also having a resident of affordable housing as a member of the board, and that could be of different kinds. It could be rental, it could be homeownership or something like that. But that might get more to that area of feedback of somebody who does struggle to afford market rate housing, for example. So those are my thoughts there.
Well, I just wanted to agree with Aaron about some sort of criteria for the renter.
I was proposing it as a separate person, but.
As a separate person.
Well, like a homeowner, a renter, and a resident of affordable housing.
Oh, okay.
And, okay, Bob.
Thank you, Lisa. That was a great start. And, so I'll just agree with a couple of things. I was going to actually make the same point that Mary did, which is I think it would be, if we could figure out a way, it would be great to have some sort of representation of people who don't live in Boulder, because keep in mind, one of our goals is to allow people who work here to live here. And if we just have people who live here already, we're not going to get that perspective. So I don't know how we're going to make that work, but I think it's really, really important. I agree with Aaron's approach on the if the voters allow us to go to 7, to wait on appointing those 2 people until after we get that permission, because otherwise it's kind of awkward. They're ex officio, and if the voters say no, then I guess we told them to go home. Or I'm not sure. And I think it's going to be a lot of work just appointing 5. So maybe we do 5 this year and 2 next year. And I like the ex officio, the permanent ex officios from Planning Board and the TRG. I think those are all good. I'd like to throw in a few preferences. So we're talking about requirements, and then we're talking about preferences. So one of the requirements was a renter, and I think that's great. We can talk about whether 1 is a sufficient number or not. But I think you also in your materials also talked about preferences, and this doesn't have to be hardwired. These are just preferences. We're always looking for balances, gender balance, and so on and so forth. A couple of preferences that I would put out there without being prescriptive would be geographic. So we wouldn't want all 5 or 7 of them to come from the same sub-community. Our preference would be to have them spread out across town. I think my preference would be to have more than 1 renter. Maybe with Aaron's amendment, that starts to get a little closer to where we need to be. Because again, that's the cohort, to some extent, we're really focused on. People who already own homes and already live here are probably in pretty good shape. It's the folks who can't afford to buy homes, or the people who can't afford to live in Boulder are the folks we're trying to help. And so they are the best situated to share with us what some of their needs are. I get the fact that we also want neighborhood input, because per Lisa's laundry list of innovative things, some of those could affect people who live here as well. So I think we're looking for a balance between those 2. So we could go on and on about cohorts. We could talk about age cohorts. We could talk certainly gender. And so I would just say that would all be preferences, and obviously it's up to this council and future councils to make that weighting decision.
First of all, I'm fine, Lisa, with your proposal. That sounds great. Either whatever we choose, I don't have a preference so much on the number right now. As much as this cohort, the experience of people who rent versus own is vastly different in this community. And 54% of them rent and 46 own. And so if we were going to do a truly representational board, it would be, if there were 7 members, 4 would be renters. And they are neighborhood people too. Renters live in our neighborhoods. So we could still do that from each of our sub-communities. And we know that about 10% of our residents live in affordable housing, so I think that's a really important demographic. And then that could fall in either the rent or own category, because there's those who rent at BHP, those who own through Thistle or whatnot. And then finally, I think a mobile home owner is really important. We have thousands of mobile homes, and that experience is, again, really, really different than either renters or owners in real property. So I think as we're forming this board, it's really, really important that we get that diversity of perspective.
Okay. Cindy? I'm sorry, Sam, and then Cindy.
So I'm pretty good with Aaron and Lisa's combined suggestion of start with 5, give them their staggered terms, and then if charter amendment passes that we get to 7, then we'll figure out how to add the other 2. Certainly support the ex officio members. I think the TRG, if there's somebody there willing to sit as an ex officio on this, and a planning board. I know it is a little more for planning board, but I expect they'll be interested, to be honest with you. I mean, we usually don't have, when I was on planning board, we didn't have much trouble filling the landmarks, and I think this will be even more interesting. I for sure want to see a renter and a homeowner, but beyond that, I really trust council to kind of make this blend. I agree. I would support having as broad a spectrum of experiences on the board as possible, but also I would like to have some people who know something about housing, regardless of where they live. So in other words, if we have a person that we say that guy, girl has experience in housing finance, and they've previously lived as a renter and now they happen to be a homeowner, I think we could benefit from that experience. So it's really hard to, make a bunch of prescriptive slots, because you get people who have really interesting combination backgrounds. So I guess for me, I feel it's important that we have a renter and a homeowner, and beyond that, I'd hope that we look really at the people and their experience individually and try and build a diverse board. So I'm kind of more where Bob is, I think, in saying that I have preferences, that we have people with this broad experience, but I don't want to prescriptively say you have to have this and that and the other. I think the one other thing that I'll point out is I believe in charter, it says that all of our advisory boards have to have a mix of genders. So I believe there's always going to have to be that to factor in as well.
Cindy.
So I, like Bob's idea, I agree with what everyone said about the numbers. And I like Bob's idea of the geographic diversity, because I think that will give us I see this as a community board in the sense that it really represents diverse elements of the community, but the housing issues are really grounded in community. And I think that it's important that they are well represented. There are lots of people who in our community learn about housing and issues through dealing in their neighborhoods and with issues that are involving their neighborhoods. One of the groups that hasn't been mentioned is people who can't afford to stay in Boulder. And rather than worrying about people coming into Boulder and needing to have a say in it, I'd rather, that would be fine ex officio, but I would rather have more people involved who are from here, who are seeing the sort of radical changes and challenges that we're all dealing with, and will have a positive say in evaluating and moving us forward that way. But I think all of the questions and responses here, who knew there'd be so much enthusiasm for this housing board? It's really great.
Why didn't you bring it up sooner, Lisa?
Yeah, Lisa.
I wish.
Funny that you asked. Do you want to read Mirabai?
So I have something from Mirabai, and I told her I would read for her. So I'm Mirabai right now, where I'm reading from Mirabai. Mirabai wrote, and she can't be here tonight. 1, she favors a 7 or 9 member board in order to get a greater diversity of opinions. Two, we learned at council meeting last month that the city already has 3 or 4 housing advisory committees consisting of housing developers, real estate experts, financial experts. That important perspective seems well represented. Thus, I would like this new board to mainly consist of lay people, that is, community members at large. It is important that our advisory boards also benefit from the perspectives and ideas of everyday citizens. Boulder has smart, talented residents. It's a resource we shouldn't overlook. And then 3, her last point, is one of the things she heard most consistently on the campaign trail is that neighborhoods feel they receive the impacts of housing decisions and policies without any real voice in the decisions. It's not to say neighborhoods won't change, but they should have an active role in shaping that change. This new board represents an opportunity for them to have actual seats at the table. So that's from Mirabai.
Great. Well, I wonder if we could codify some of our intentions. So maybe not, I get what people are saying about prescriptive is tough. Like you want to be able to tap the best people with diverse experiences. And if you put on too many rules, then you lose some of that ability. But, like when we appoint boards, for each one of them it has, well, you have to have at least one man, one woman, or you might have to have 2 design professionals or whatever. But could we get something maybe written into that, at that level that says, we look for in this board people who have experienced, housing challenges, who come from diversity types of housing, who perhaps a mobile homeowner, like I don't know exactly what it is, but we've had this discussion about some of the things that we're looking for in people who have experience with housing policy. So like a little, a sentence that lists some of the qualities that we're looking for in board members so that we're reminded of that and future councils are reminded of that as they appoint future board members.
I tag on to that. Yeah. And following on that, in addition to expressing our desire for this diversity, I would suggest that when you form the application, you ask those specific questions. Are you a renter? Are you an owner? How long have you lived in Boulder? What sub-community do you live in? What's your experience? In other words, have them call that out. So then when we look at these applications, we can kind of put them in piles, or here's the renter pile, here's the homeowner pile, and these are the people who live here, and people want to live here, or sub-communities, or however we want to organize it. So let's be very, very specific about those questions and force them to answer the questions ahead of time.
So I'm going to jump in. So I agree with all of this. I do think that we want to, and it's already been said, but I want to underscore it. We want diverse people who have a profound interest in housing policy and problem solving or solutions. And I think that should be, whatever the right words to say. You can't just, if you've never thought about it, you've never done it, but you kind of think, no, we need people that are really going to advise us on one of our biggest challenges. So I just want that would be the kind of the first thing, and then we look for all these different types of experiences around that. It sounds like since nobody's mentioning professional experience that we're kind of doing away with that, and I would suggest maybe we replace it with that, this interest and experience with housing issues and policy. Or something like that.
Yeah, and can I speak? I would just hope that we don't scare away somebody who might be really interested and has not had housing challenges, but has a wealth of experience in real estate. Or, I don't want to get into these professional skills, but for me, I'm hoping we can encourage what you just said, Zan, and maybe you guys can go back and, but that we want to make sure that we have people who are interested in advancing our housing policies and our programs and have some experience. But we also want to encourage people who feel like they want to apply, that they can apply. We don't lay out for planning board, well, you have to have this experience in planning and stuff like that. That comes out in the planning board application and in our interview. And we don't take somebody for planning board or any of our boards that have.
Right. I just think instead of saying you have to make your living in this sector, It's just that we're taking that out and saying, nope, you just have to have some experience and a profound love of working on these issues. Okay, we have Sam, then and Mary, and then Jill.
I want to be a bit of a curmudgeon here because Matt's no longer with us, so I'll be Matt tonight. And I want to push back a little bit on the idea that we're going to list a bunch of things and put people in piles. I mean, in particular, the piles thing really rubs me the wrong way because somebody could have been a renter before and now they're a homeowner. They could have been a renter and a homeowner and now they're back to being a renter for something that changed in their life. So I want us to do what you were suggesting, I think, Aaron, which is say, talk about characteristics we want in applicants, like we want you to be passionate about housing and knowledgeable about housing policy and dedicated to, helping us better our housing policy in Boulder. Here are some of the things that we think that we want to have as experiences from the applicants, and then just list them in no particular order, because I think it's the sum of the parts in the applicants that are going to make them the most appealing. So I just want to be careful that we're not trying to just tick a bunch of boxes and that we look at the whole of the experience of the people.
Can I add on and just say that collectively, we want the board to have a breadth of diversity of these types. And that way, it's no one person. It's more that we're going to look for, as we add people and people come off, that we'll be looking to have a breadth of that. Okay, Mary and then Jill.
So kind of along those lines and adding to what Aaron proposed is, let's not forget that there's a link among housing, transportation, and the cost of childcare. So there's that triad. So somehow including that those viewpoints are also part of the equation would be great.
And I think I feel like Sam does, but when it comes to the professional experience, that sometimes we categorize professionals into one lump, and they're actually, we're all community members. I know real estate professionals that are young and renting and paying off student loans, and I know real estate professionals who have millions of dollars and own 20 houses in Boulder. It's totally different. Same with developers. Not all of them are created equal. We've got small scale incrementalist developers, and we have big, as big as you want to go out of state. So I think, just like you're saying with this, or maybe you rent and maybe you own, I think it's important for us not to lump professionals into categories either.
Okay. Are you going to make something out of this soup?
I have a process question. We'll go ahead, Jeff.
And I'll ask if there's any other clarifiers. The one thing that's not clear enough to me is whether you want the ordinance to specify a renter or multiple renters or not. I don't think you want, I have heard that you don't want to specify any other categories of members.
I was suggesting a renter and a homeowner. I thought Aaron and Lisa said that.
Yeah, I heard pretty good consensus on that. That one bit we did want to get in there. One renter, at least one renter, at least one homeowner.
Got it.
Do we want to do one resident of affordable housing or previous resident of affordable housing? You had proposed that, Aaron. I like that, but.
I would leave it open and let the council decide. If we get too prescriptive and we have that requirement, then we're going to have to keep opening and we don't get somebody of that requirement to apply. I like where Sam's going. We all come with a whole host of different experiences in life. And just like you said, you just went through all these professionals. You can't categorize those people. So for me, I'm hoping that the council can look at the quality of the applicants, make sure we have a renter. That renter might be an affordable housing renter. It just depends on the quality of that candidate. And one homeowner. And because if we're going to start with 5, I want to make sure we get the best people on here as possible.
And I think if we
represent a broad perspective of the community.
Can I follow on that just briefly? I think when there's only 5, it's really important that we be very careful and just specify like renter and homeowner. When we go to 7, maybe we can revisit this, because when you go to 7, you have if it happens, if the people vote for it, then you have more latitude if you have 3 that are kind of prescriptive, but out of 7. Anyway, we could revisit that idea if we haven't.
I do think that we should have that sentence that said, in filling spots on this board, the council will be looking for a collectively at the candidates to bring a diversity of having lived in diverse housing types, who have, whatever, blah, blah, blah. But I would just spell that, because we do want to leave breadcrumbs for following council members.
And I wonder if we can include ethnic and racial background in that, because I think that does affect how you experience housing in Boulder.
Yeah. But
I
isn't
believe
that in
that's already part of the charter requirements for board membership that you'll consider.
That you'll consider it.
Yes, and I think diversity can cover a range of characteristics also.
Yeah, I do have a
And
process.
again, I would say the more vague you make it, the less pigeonholed you would be in possibly not having applicants to fill that spot.
I wasn't suggesting pigeonholing, because we're talking about a list of different qualities that we're interested in considering in people.
But I'm glad that applies to all our boards. Okay, is this the last question?
Well, there's, it may not be a question, but it really is incumbent upon you to determine the speed with which this can move forward, given the need for you to, if you choose to use the same selection procedures, some time of yours to interview candidates. And we will need some time to prepare application materials, which you may or may not want to review what we are asking, so that you'll have that information when you go to interview and select. So I don't know that if you want to take that up tonight.
So go
or not.
fast.
Yeah.
Is that the question? You want us to tell you to go fast?
Yes.
Add an hour, I think it's probably a couple hours of interview to your existing interview schedule. That's probably as fast as it can get done. Or you'll need to schedule interview times probably early April.
So here, can I make a suggestion on that?
Yep.
I've talked to a number of people in the community who are interested in both this board and other existing boards. And I think to the extent possible, I know some of it's dependent upon us, I'd like to suggest that the application deadline be the same, because if we stagger it, if we have all the other boards and commissions and then housing, we put people in a very difficult position because they don't, should I wait for the housing board or should I apply for one of these things? And I think to the extent we can have the same February 16th deadline, I know that puts you guys under the gun as far as putting the application together, because it's only a couple of weeks. We can be doing the ordinance in parallel. I'm not worried about the ordinance part of it, but I'd like to throw that out there for discussion. I know that's pretty darn quick.
I just suggested just a slight modification to that, which is with the goal of appointing people at the same time so people can apply to multiple boards, but perhaps the application deadline's a week or two later and you just let it shift a little bit to give a little more breathing room to prepare the application.
But then we would try to interview them more or less the same time in March and make the appointments at the same time at the end of March.
Yeah, and if we can't do it in the same number of nights, and we may need to add another night of interviews.
I'd like to suggest we actually, in fact, do that, because we're gonna have a lot of applicants, and we're making 5 appointments. So I think I'd almost suggest that if we do add a night, that be dedicated towards the housing board. Maybe there's a few makeups from other boards, but.
Okay, people who don't like extra meetings, be forewarned. I actually think we'll need to do that. And it'd be nice if we did it when half the council wasn't at NLC. So, okay, we'll ask staff, CAC, to find another evening, but it'll have to be a non-Tuesday, so prepare yourself.
And it will need to be before the 20th of March. If your goal is to be able to share applications to multiple boards and consider them, that's when you're making your other appointments. So
Sees the 11th to the 14th. So is it before March 11th then?
Wait a minute, I'm just.
Yeah, we're going to have,
So-
this will be tricky.
So we have,
We're gonna
if
try
I,
to jam.
if I have this right, we have our council meeting on the 5th, caucus, March, caucus on the 6th. Board interviews start on the 8th, Thursday. Board interviews continue on the 13th and the 15th. then we have a council meeting, if I'm correct, on the 20th. And maybe we could do something on the 19th.
Yep, I was going to suggest just that.
Maybe we could have the interview on the 19th.
And is the 20th when we're making appointments?
Yeah, currently.
All right, we're going to earn our spring break this year.
Yep.
Well,
And our-
does the 19th work for all of us?
I think it works for me.
Yeah, I can do it.
So it's only Mirabai and, okay, so why don't we go ahead and just say that?
We
Say
need
that?
to tape them.
What?
We need to tape them as well.
We
in
are.
case
Yeah, we got
somebody-
that
Okay.
confirmed, that they'll be taped.
But
for
that one would be somebody'd have to watch it on the 20th.
On this schedule, there are two things. One is that there will likely only be about 2 weeks from the time we are able to get the application materials up and then the deadline, unless we want to take up Councilmember Brockett's suggestion of extending the deadline for this one board.
I'd be okay with Aaron's suggestion of extending it a week or, when are they due now? This
16th.
February 16th?
Well, we won't be interviewing them till March 19th, so it seems
Yeah,
like we can let that slide 2
even
weeks.
2 weeks,
Yeah.
I would be okay, if that gives you guys some wiggle
And the
room.
other practical question is, as a new board, there isn't a set of questions that have been used, so those need to be developed and provided as part of the application process. Moving quickly limits your ability to weigh in on that. We could provide them
We have a
on
board
a hotline, we could do it
Boards and
at
commissions.
CAC, but if we want to get it up, together and out to the public by the end of next week, let's say, those are probably.
Who's our boards and commission committee?
I don't know. None of us know our jobs. But I
make them
would
do it.
suggest maybe you guys do the first round, give them to us, and if council members want to add on to those questions or modify them, then we could do that and get them back to you and then out by date certain. Well, that's what we do with our other boards and commissions.
I would also say that the questionnaire can't possibly be perfect the first time, since we're giving you just a few weeks to do it. It means that we have to ask good interview questions as well, because the questionnaires are very important, but the interviews are equally important. And so if we have time to think about it and there's holes in the questionnaire because we haven't given you enough time to really go around the circle on it, then it's up to us, I think, to ask consistent questions during the interviews that fill in those gaps.
And we have 20 boards and commission sets of applications, and I don't know what council's ever weighed in on those, certainly not anytime recently. So I would just tend to trust the staff. You heard a lot of the things that we care about. I would tend to trust you guys to put together the first application. If we think you did a really, really bad job, you'll probably hear from us for next year's round.
Well, how about this?
Actually, that's not true, Bob.
What?
We have, council generally does weigh in on board and application.
But
At this
it's been a
period of
few
time.
years. Okay, Jill, and then I have a thought. Yeah.
I'm going to be a contrarian here after listening to this conversation. I think it's really fast. When I applied for planning board, these bigger, more important boards, you want the opportunity to sit down individually with council members. I did that with many of you. It also, you want to think about the questions, even meet with other, people in the field. It just doesn't feel like this gives people time to really do a good job. And I hear what you're saying, Bob, because I've had other people like, oh man, I'd go for TAB if I don't get the Housing Advisory Board, but I kind of, whatever it is. But you know what? So what? They should just go for what their first choice is. And if they don't get it, there's 7 months later, there's another application period. It just seems
or they can run for
really,
council.
or they can run for council. Hey,
Yeah, the big movie press.
no, but it just seems really fast, and we want to get this right, and we want good people, and we want to know who we're appointing. And
Well, wait, but which part is, when you say it's fast, you mean them having to come up with a questionnaire or people?
them coming up with a questionnaire, the people getting notice that this is happening and that it's open and that what the function is. I spent months preparing to apply for planning board, well before the application's even open, just talking to people in this field. And we're not giving people any real chance to think or It just seems really fast.
Okay, go ahead.
I would suggest, I mean, I think Heidi told us there's already like 17 people who have applied for this board. So there have been people out there thinking about it. I like Bob's recommendation with Aaron's caveat of giving staff 2 more weeks. Because people do, if they're going to go to the effort of applying for a board, and this interview isn't going to happen until the 19th, so it's even longer. So right now they have 2 months. They have 2 months to prepare. I think there's a lot of people who are pretty savvy. We've had different housing processes and stuff. So I would like to get this board seated at the same time. And if people, and usually people apply for multiple boards. I think you applied for a couple boards. People apply for 2 or 3 boards. So from my perspective, just getting it going, and these are staggered terms. So I assume there will be a 1-year term, a 2-year term, up to 5. So, and then we can evaluate, okay, here's somebody a little green, maybe we'll give that person a 1 year, and here's somebody who walks on water, and we'll give that person a 5-year, something like that.
I'm not going to dig my heels in at this point. I just want to make sure that we're doing this right. And I don't think just because people want a backup option is our reason to rush.
No, you appreciate that.
So, given that, can you just spell out the timeline based on what we said? When do you think you can get out applications?
Depending on the amount of input and whether it's all consistent or not on any questions, I think, and I've talked with the city clerk staff, we can get that up and posted by the end of next week, if not sooner, which would give, and if we're going to go an extra 2 weeks, that gives a month of time for people to apply. If you can schedule the interviews on the 19th, I don't see why you can't meet that 20th appointment deadline.
Okay. Is it okay to shoot for that? And if, okay.
Well, and I would also suggest, because right now I'm starting to write questions, if people...
You're such a nerd.
If people have suggestions, I would suggest that they just send their questions to staff, and staff can look at those. It's not like they have to pick ours, but it just helps them with, here's some ideas.
And we're
here's some
talking 3 or 4, right?
Yeah.
3 to 5 is pretty common.
So, fine. If you have thoughts, get them in this week. How about that?
Yep. As I look at the schedule, we may not be able to get all the other pieces done in time for an April meeting of the board. If we could try, but you'll have to. I don't know, Aaron. I'm going to put you on the spot. If the ordinance is, when can a board be seated? If the ordinance has to be passed, and we have 30 days.
Well, I think a board could be chosen before the ordinance was final. You know, the ordinance controls, I think, when the first board meeting would happen. So 30 days after passage of the ordinance, sometime after that, the board could sit and have an agenda and have their first meeting.
Can I ask a question? Couldn't you start them with some of the ABCs of housing? And, I mean, take them to the comp plan, talk about our housing policies, talk to them about these different boards or committees, the TRG, CDOC. I mean, just give them a 101 on housing and types of housing challenges. I mean,
And we have a model for that. The Affordable Housing Task Force actually had about 9 meetings where a significant portion of the time was spent on individual pieces of orientation materials, as it were.
And did we decide, are they meeting monthly?
That's the standard established in the charter. We will depend on the work plan and how they want to operate, I suppose, whether they want to meet more frequently.
So I, of course, have an idea about this as well. And and I would like, because housing is such a challenge and we have so many, and for me, it's very timely. I mean, and I guess I'm wondering if we could do 2 times a month. So just hear me out, hear me out. So if you start with 12 months, then go by 2. And if you have the little circle where TRG comes in and meets with them 4 times a year, 24 minus 4 is 20. Then there's holidays, there's winter holidays, there's spring holidays, and there's summer. Then I would take another 6 or 7 out of there, and then you're down to 12, 13. So maybe have it monthly, but then, yeah, this would be a good way to go. Maybe have it have it monthly, but then 4 additional times a year, these financial people weigh in and meet with the board and talk to them or advise them, have that interchange.
You said like an additional study session.
Yeah.
Okay. Do we have to resolve that?
I don't think so. In the charter, there has the regular monthly meeting language and also the ability to hold special meetings.
Okay.
The other thing is, I think, for purposes of the application, I think people are going to want to know, is this a weekly gig or a monthly gig? So I like Lisa's final approach, which is monthly with some additional meetings, just set people's expectations.
Keeping in mind, they have to staff them. Okay. So are we done?
Got one more. So this is outside of the 3 questions, so I thought those were great. If we could go to slide 15 in the presentation, potential work plan items. For sure, I agree with orientation, fee waivers, and expedited project review. I think have been on the list for affordable housing, that's on the wish list for the affordable housing developers. And I'm fine with starting with those because those have been things we've talked about for a while to get here. Then it goes to regional housing coordination and mobile home strategy. And I think mobile home strategy is important to keep here. I would like to add to this, and I don't know where it comes around regional housing coordination, but the down payment assistance shared equity program, because that's one of the types of things that I think we could really benefit from a housing advisory board, you know, having them wrestle some details to the ground and go around with staff and really kind of understand how it would work, and in the context of a pilot. So I would like to add that and get the feedback from them towards the fall timeframe when we heard that you'll actually be able to have bandwidth to get going on that. So anyway, I just thought I would throw that in there because I think we could benefit from hearing from them about that.
I'll just acknowledge that I know that it was missing.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't think they should work on that?
I absolutely do. I absolutely think they should work on it. I'm just, when the slide went up there, I realized it was missing.
That was a mea culpa, not I omitted it intentionally.
Right.
But, hey, well, to that end, at some point, I do think preserving existing housing, something that everybody agrees on, and BHP had some ideas that they wanted us to think about, I would throw that up there as also good feet wetting material.
You might have, you know, some board meetings where BHP might come and talk to them about here's the challenges they're looking at, and
I think
Thistle, any of the housers, you know.
I think there's enough big stuff going on that 2 meetings a month for the rest of the year is probably not an overreach in order to really get their heads around these, because these are all interesting and complicated.
Yep. Okay, let's stop before we make the list too long. Yeah?
Well, it just,
Oh, you're going to add?
yeah, well, no, just back on the coordination with planning board, there's a lot that we've worked out tonight, and I don't want to try to pin this to the ground right now, but I think we do need to figure out how they're going to interact with planning board on the areas of common interest. And in particular, like, planning board will make motions on particular language on, leading up to ordinances, right? So that's very specific. And so I don't, if you get something competing from the housing board, that could be difficult. So can we just keep that in mind and think about it? And at some point, we're going to have to define how those relations work together. Thank you.
Hey, we good?
Yep. Thank you.
You good?
Thank you.
All right, I think we're done.
Thank you and good night.
Early. We're done early.
Are we? I don't know about
We're going
that.
to go to 9:30.
Oh, what, did we make it longer?
What took you so long?